We're conducting a second interview session with Mr. James VandenBosch of Ada, Michigan. The interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. VandenBosch, in the first chunk of our interview, we had gone through your training as a Navy corpsman, your service on naval ships, and we gotten you then assigned to the Marine Corps and into Vietnam. And through a couple of assignments, including an operation called Bold Mariner in the Battalion Peninsula. And then after that, fairly quickly, your unit, 3rd Battalion, 26th Marines, gets assigned to a new operation. And can you tell us what it was called and a little bit about what that operation was?
The second major operation that we got involved in was called Taylor Common. And it involved the typical mission that 326 was assigned to, and that's a search and destroy mission. You may recall that in '68 there was this major Tet offensive all over the country of South Vietnam, and they anticipated there was going to be another one the following year, which is the time frame that I'm talking about. It was 1969, same general time of the year, early spring in our terms. The mission was to vertically insert the battalion into an area known as Dodge City, Arizona Territory. Those names that were bandied about rather frequently, and they had meaning to someone, some kind of humor, I guess, offbeat humor involved in naming those things. But it was an area between Da Nang and Chu Lai. Roughly, I have no idea how much actual area that was comprised of, but it wasn't. It was an area probably 50 to 60 miles deep, and from the coast to the mountains. And again, I have no reference to how much actually but it was a fairly large area. And the reason why it was strategically important was because that it covered the approaches to Da Nang. Da Nang is one of the major cities in the northern part of South Vietnam. It's a very important seaport. And we had a lot of our resources there, the MACV headquarters, a lot of the Marine Corps headquarters, the entire that part of South Vietnam was controlled by the Marine Corps. So our job was to go in, be inserted into this area, patrol throughout for as long as it took, and sort of act as a blocking force for Da Nang, so that the bad guys could not approach from the south. And so, which was a typical mission, we vertically inserted, and then.
When you say vertically inserted, what does that actually mean?
Well, it means that we went into our combat by helicopter, CH-46s. We did not launch from a ship or anywhere. Well, a ship offshore. We were not going in on boats. We were being inserted by helicopter, which was a major way of getting around in Vietnam anyway. But we were assigned as a vertical assault group. That was one of the titles that we had. This area was what I would call it's on the coast. It's flatland. It's rice paddies, occasional low hills, but not jungle territory. It's mostly just flat and featureless for the most part, except for the rice paddies.
Did it change as you went inland and moved toward the mountains?
Well, yeah, it depended on which direction you went. And later on we were in fact in the mountainous area, but not on this particular operation. What the tactic was to put an entire battalion of Marines into an area of operations, or AO, and then just literally patrol everything you could find. And often what happened was we would cross and crisscross again the areas that we had been previously in. And it was a matter of just searching for bad guys and their weapons caches and their food, and that they had to be supported by the locals in order to remain in that area, because especially in the case of NVA, North Vietnamese regular army, they had to be supported by the locals. Their supply chains were much too long to maintain themselves in those areas. So we knew that they were being supported by the local population to some degree. Some of those were Viet Cong. But when it got to the point of the Tet Offensive, and especially in '69, it became apparent that we were dealing with more than just raggedy Andy Viet Cong, because we were beginning to run into organized resistance with people with uniforms and better weapons and all that sort of thing. So, and that was another reason why we were there. This operation, Taylor Common, was the longest operation, I think, in my tenure there. It lasted almost 2 months. And when I talk to other people, for example, some of the Army people that I talked to, their operations were somewhat less than that. And they were always supported by some forward operating base of some sort. Marine Corps operated completely different than that. We had nothing like that. We simply kept on moving and patrolling, and were resupplied almost on a daily basis with things like water, chow, ammunition, and all that sort of thing. So it was a completely mobile concept, and we kept moving all the time. Taylor Common started out very innocuously. We inserted with a cool LZ. We didn't have any problems getting off the birds and setting up, which was not all that uncommon actually for the large operation like that. And it's a massive influx of troops.
Now, before you would go in, would there normally be some kind of bombardment or effort to use artillery or air power to clear out a landing zone, or would that vary? Or
I think that varied from operation to operation. The Batangan Peninsula had been pre-landing bombardment, heavy bombardment by ships offshore and artillery and the whole 9 yards. But in this particular operation, I don't believe there was any of that. We just all of a sudden show up over the horizon with a bunch of helicopters and land. So we land and we set up, and then you just sort of sit around for a couple of days. You set up a camp, put your hooches up, and everybody just sort of tries to get the lay of the land before you kick the operation off. And there's no element of surprise when about 1,000 Marines land in your backyard. So you know everybody knows you're there, which is probably actually part of the grand plan when you think about it.
well, I guess it can be a question of whether you're more of a deterrent force as opposed to one that would actually root out all of the enemy who were there. If you simply prevent them from messing up what you're doing, announcing yourself, I guess, would be fine.
Yeah. Well, and then, like I said, that may have been part of the setup for this whole thing. And like I said, we were there to try to prevent, in this case, NVA regulars from getting into Da Nang. So, yeah, for a couple of days you sit there, and then, the yacht plan comes down. They talk through the radio net, and they decide who's going to go where. When you think there are 3 companies of Marines in a general large area, they all have to have a different place to go, otherwise we'd be tramping all over each other. So they figure out the lay of the land, they look at the maps, and then they decide where you're going to go and how you're going to do it. So a couple of days sitting around, drinking hot chocolate for the troops, and the people, the powers that be, are making all the decisions and putting that together. And then all of a sudden, one day, you just get this notice it's time to pack up and move on. And of course, we're all walking around in our full combat gear and tropical weather, and believe me, I think the environment was as much of an enemy as the actual bad guys were in many cases, and I've heard that said before too. But somehow you adapt to that. We just became foot soldiers, and that was our job, and that's what we did. So we set off one day, and typically they would go 3 or 4 clicks on a map, a 1,000-meter grid, and try to figure out which is the best way to go that might achieve whatever the mission for that day was. And they usually picked a place, depending on how far you went, what time of day it was, you'd pick a place 3 or 4 clicks away and then set up another camp, and just would have moved from place to place that way. This first day that we went on the operation is when we ran into this major explosive device that killed Gunny Kemp. But the thing about that is that when those things happen, your mission is paramount. Individuals are important, but the mission supersedes all of that. So then when you lose people, I mean, that's a fact of war, and you just keep moving on. I think of that particular incident. I know we visited it once before, but it keeps coming back to me. I think of that particular incident as a moment when I had lost a friend who I only know for a few days, actually. But that was one of the goofy things about Vietnam. You didn't know people, the people that we were with. And then if you hook up with somebody and make a connection, even for a few days, that becomes important. It's part of the whole fabric of being in that environment. So then when you lose those people, and by this time I had only made a couple of close connections, lost both of them. Mm-hmm. So in my job was, again, it was a little bit different than the average guy in the trenches. I was a medical guy. I was supposed to be able to help these guys. I was supposed to be able to cure, salve their wounds and save their lives and get them out of there, which for the most part we did. But then inevitably you lose some of those people. What happens over a period of time is that you start to become, at least I did, detached from what was actually going on. It became a process of becoming a technician rather than a caregiver per se. It was I hate to say this, but it was a colder way of dealing with the issues, because if you didn't do that, if you got so involved in each one of the individuals that you lose, it would be overwhelming. Mm-hmm. So we coined a phrase used throughout Vietnam: it don't mean nothing. And of course it did, but that's the whole point.
But in the meantime, it enabled you.
In the meantime, you had to keep on moving. You couldn't stop and mourn for every individual that you lost. So anyway, moving on from that, shortly after the gunny was killed, I think it was about a day later, we had it set in a camp at the very same place, and we got the word from battalion about, as it was getting dusk and getting dark, that they wanted Lima Company to move from where we were to a place about, I want to say, another 3 or 4 clicks away in a different direction. And the area was completely, this particular area was all rice paddies. There were just huge, immense rice paddies with dikes all over, just square patches of ground filled with water. That's what rice paddies are. Well, one of the incredible things about that is it was getting dark. And I can remember clearly the skipper, because he and I were always in close proximity to each other in the CP group, arguing with the colonel of the battalion that it's nearly impossible to take an entire company of Marines and nearly 200 men on a night march through the rice paddies when you can't see or do anything, and it certainly would not be unnoticed by the enemy, because you can't take that many men going anywhere in the middle of the night and not make noise.
And weren't the enemy used to moving around at night?
Well, that was their, yeah. The night belonged to Charlie, we used to say, and then during the day they would hide, and then at night they'd come out and lob grenades and stuff at you. But well, anyway, Skipper lost the argument, and I have to believe that someone at the battalion had a higher reason for doing what we were doing, because I don't think, certainly in my experience, it never happened before. And it was a very difficult thing to do. So as it got dark, we loaded up our gear and off we set through this maze of just dozens and dozens of rice paddies, splashing, cursing, falling down. You got all these guys with heavy equipment, mortar plates that are 40, 60 pounds, machine guns, all this kind of stuff. And we're actually slopping through rice paddies up to our knees sometimes in water, and the muck at the bottom of those paddies was like glue. You just sit down with your additional weight, and you'd walk into the stuff. Your boots would sink into the stuff. In order to pull your feet out, it was like sucking through a pudding. It was just like you know, well, what was terribly strenuous, I mean, just walking through that would have been, but make it completely dark when you can't even see your hand before your face and there's no light allowed of any kind. This is what we did through the entire night. And I had no idea how far we went. We certainly could not have gone very far under those circumstances, but when dawn broke, we were actually climbing out of the last rice paddy, and I can recall vividly sitting down, because I was exhausted, and the whole company was. I mean, just think about that. It's just amazing how we did that. Anyway, sitting down and having a cup of coffee, found some solid ground, dry ground, and just getting down, relaxing, and trying to catch our breath and just recuperate a little bit. No sooner had we started having a little cup of coffee than a firefight breaks out. And of course, what had happened was, even under the extraordinary circumstances that I still have trouble believing, we had caught somebody by surprise on the other side of that mess that we were crossing. And our lead elements just ran into some guys, a VC, and were running around, and they started a little firefight. Well, and this is one of the first actual firefights that we had gotten into, as a matter of fact, because the previous operation, there was no contact with the enemy at all. So this was my very first time with the actual combat, you know, face-to-face stuff. And of course, being uninitiated, the first time you get involved in something like that, you simply don't know what to do. There's sort of chaos. The Marines, of course, rely on their training, and they do exactly what they know how to do, and the best to do. They simply charge. They don't sit around and wait to get pot shot at. They just take off and charge at the plane, and that's what they do. That's their main modus operandi. That's their process. Anyway, I'm just sitting there thinking, oh, okay, well, now what? You know, crack, 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 crack. And when an AK-47 is fired at you, it has a very distinct sound. It's unlike the other weapons, and you can almost tell by the sound of it what kind of a weapon it is. Anyway, it's scary, and it's hairy, and there's people running around. And first of all, you lay on the ground, you don't know, okay, where's it coming from? What am I supposed to do? I know I can't stay here, so you just get up and move. And of course, like I said before, the skipper had that tendency anyway. As soon as something happened, he was gone, and I was supposed to be everywhere he was. So, in fact, what I did was I grabbed my rifle and I ran wherever I thought the skipper was. It was a short-lived encounter. I think probably not more than 15 minutes. And a lot of our firefights were like that, because we were dealing with a type of an enemy in a guerrilla warfare setting where they don't have large groups of people in most cases. And in some of these cases, that's what it was. It wasn't a large body of enemy soldiers. It was a few VC probably just wandering around, and maybe they were just getting used to it, starting to have their breakfast too. I don't know, but anyway, it started very quickly and it ended very quickly, and it was about 15 minutes, not more than that. In the process, we had taken several casualties, however, and I think by the time I rolled around behind the skipper, I found him, the thing was over already. So, and the Marines were starting to bring the casualties to me. My role as the senior corpsman was to establish triage, gather the rest of the medical resources in the form of the other company, the platoon corpsman. We would set up a triage, and then prioritize casualties, and then get them into the medevac chain. We would call, there were different levels of medevac that you could call. This particular case, I remember one Marine who had been gut shot, and I don't know his name. This is one of the great tragedies of this whole thing. And maybe on purpose, I simply don't remember all the names of the people. Over my time in the bush, I medevaced at least 150, 200 Marines, at least that number. And so I couldn't possibly remember all the names anyway. But This particular young man had been gunshot, and we had talked. We had about 6 or 7 casualties, I think, from that particular firefight, and they were all pretty stable. We didn't lose anybody on that particular one, but this young man, I talked to him. I remember sitting and talking with him, and we had dressed his wound and all that we could do in the field, awaiting his medevac. And you know, you always have conversations with these guys, and they look to the corpsman as their doctor. I mean, it's sort of like a civilian going to the doctor's office. In the field, a corpsman is the doctor for the Marines, in Army, and their medics, same situation. So they trust, and they believe, and they plead, and you know. And so one of the art of dealing with combat casualties is that you try to soothe them, comfort them, try to instill hope. Hope is something you never ever lose, and you simply can't do that in that situation. And it works both ways too, by the way. It's not just the casualty, it's the guy that's doing the caregiving too. So and we had to maintain hope. Skipper was there. I remember talking to him at the same time, and he was consoling his Marine. And Skipper looked at me and says, "Doc, you know, how's this kid going to do?" And I said, I think he's going to be fine. I think he's going to be fine. We get him on the chopper, get him out to the hospital ship, and they'll do some surgery and fix him up good. So we left on that positive note. And then we got everybody medevaced on the way out to the ship. We got a message back a couple of hours later that this young man had died. And that sort of gave me a new perspective on those types of wounds. Gut wounds are very serious, and because of all of the damage they do internally, and they're not to ever be taken lightly. But honestly, of all of the people that I treated there, I would have thought this kid would be fine, but he wasn't, and that's just another fact of life, I guess, in that situation. That was over quickly. We kept on moving, and like I said before, we would go 4 or 5 clicks in one direction, stop and set up a camp, and then we'd go another 4 or 5 clicks in another, just crisscrossing the whole AO in a general area. And I think the other 2 companies in the battalion were doing the same thing. So they're covering a lot of territory because there are a lot of people out there. We went, after that, we moved into another area, and typically we would, like I said, crisscross the same area, but this new area that we were going into was different because we hadn't been there before. I don't know if Mike or India Company had been through there or not. We hardly ever saw them while we were in the field together, and that was there's a good reason for that. You don't put 2 companies operating in close proximity unless you have a specific mission to attack a certain area. But anyway, we got into this area that was something I had not seen before. We came to call it the rock pile. And it was so named because, unlike most of the flat country and the rice paddy territory, this place was characterized by very large rocks that were huge. They were 10, 15, 20 feet high, just like monoliths sticking up out of the ground, which is really weird for that part of Vietnam. I thought anyway.
Because it's still not really hilly or anything.
It's not really hilly. Every once in a while you'd come across a low hill of some kind, and by that I mean elevation of 50, 60 feet maybe, not huge hills, but low rolling hills. But this place, like I said, was unique in the fact that there was this large collection of these very large rocks. Typical maneuver formation for a company of Marines is to have 2 platoons on the right, one on the right flank, one on the left flank, and one in the front. They would sort of superimpose each other, and then the 3rd platoon would be following up the rear. The CP and group would be right in the middle of that, so we would just move like that. We were coming across a very large field, and coming upon this group of rocks, and the lead elements, the 2 platoons, had gotten into the rock area, and then on the left flank it flattened out, and they were patrolling through there. As the CP group and the last platoon were approaching these rocks, we suddenly started taking incoming rounds, and they had to be like 60 mic mortars because they weren't very large. You can tell the difference. And so we had part of the company was caught out in the open by these mortars. We all scrambled to the base of this hill, this little hill where these rocks were, got the guys out from behind and spread out so that they weren't all getting pot shot at that. But we laid there for a little minute. There was a little like a little berm, and the rounds kept coming in behind us, and they were marching them from our rear up into the columns as they were going through there, and those little missiles would come through, and I had 2 or 3 guys that had minor shrapnel wounds, and I was in that group, and I was just dancing back and forth from side to side, treating casualties as I went. And then one of the crazy things that happened, it happened more than once, was that when I would be moving to treat a casualty or whatever, where I had been around would land. Mm-hmm. And that happened 2 or 3 times. It was just something really weird. And once you get over the initial shock of what, you start to become functional, you move. You move, that takes a lot of energy. You're using a lot of adrenaline. You've got to keep moving. You can't stay in one place. Thank God for that, because like I said, where I had been was where a round would land. This thing developed into a major firefight. Up in the rocks, there were actually a series of these low hills, one behind the other, in about 2 or 3 ranks of them. And the bad guys were in there, and they were in those rocks, and they were in the tree line along the left flank, which was more of a flat piece of terrain. This firefight was an organized firefight. There were heavy weapons. We had never had a mortar fire before, so we knew it was a little bit different element of the enemy. We were heavily engaged for, I want to say, about 2 hours, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But it was big time stuff. We started taking heavy casualties, and I remember running over one of those hills and almost getting dinged myself. But you don't know where it's coming from. You just know that it's coming at you from somewhere out there, and you got people that you got to go and try to get out of there. But that was a difficult thing to do. I wound up pulling myself back from that little thing and then starting to set up triage, because then we started taking heavy casualties. Right. And it was the point where not only were the Marines bringing casualties back to triage, but my corpsmen were too. And a couple of them had been in some pretty heavy situations. Unfortunately, they haven't gotten wounded or anything. But this was a major firefight. We had a lot of casualties. Now, I don't know, estimate how many. I know it was more than 10, 15. This was a case where we had to try to do some heroic stuff with the casualties that we had. We had some people with head wounds, thoracic wounds, extremities. One of my corpsmen actually had gotten shot through the buttocks, which is quite a wound when you think of where it is and all that. So one of my corpsmen was being medevaced. We did cricothyroidotomy on one young Marine.
What is that?
Well, it's when if you have a facial wound or a neck wound where your airway is obstructed, you have to try to create a new airway in order for people to breathe, obviously. So what a crico is something that they talk about in corps school, but they don't necessarily train corpsmen to do these things. But we all knew what to do and how to do it and all that kind of stuff. The crico is where you take and make a hole in the trachea just below the Adam's apple, which the trachea is the main airway into the lungs, and insert some kind of a tube in there to maintain an open airway. And so we did that. We just did one on this one particular Marine, and on the LZ, waiting for the medevac choppers to come in. And of course, everybody's standing around watching this thing. So I remember coming up to, I think it was Mike Crocchiola, one of my other corpsmen, and I said, Mike, let's do a crackle. He said, really? And I said, yeah. I mean, we're gonna lose them anyway. I mean, it's not so far out that we should just try to do this. And we had never done one before. And I think somebody had actually had a little tracheal appliance, a little bent tube that was made specifically for that. And that was not part of our standard operating equipment by any means. But we did this, and we got this kid back. We got him all pinged up, and he was doing fine. But by the time we moved him from where we were doing a procedure down to the LZ, he died. But it wasn't without trying to save his life, and we always did everything we thought we could do, even though it wasn't necessarily according to the book. A lot of that stuff, that's something they just don't teach you to do. But anyway, several casualties, at least 10, maybe more. We called in a medevac. The firefight was pretty much under control about 2 or 3 hours into it. So we had the chance to medevac our casualties, and we had IVs going and all that kind of stuff. And the medevac, the 46 came in, loaded them on the bird, including my corpsman, the one who'd been shot in the backside. And as it was lifting off from the LZ, it got shot down. And the bird flew probably, I'm going to say about 100 yards in full view airman, just went down and crashed. It was a soft landing. It didn't explode or anything on contact. It just could not fly. It hit the hydraulics or something. I don't know.
It landed in a rice paddy?
And it landed in a field that was bordered on a tree line, and it was like in a corner of a tree line like that. In that tree line, there were 50 cal machines that were shooting. They had shot it down, and then they were peppering it too after it landed. So we're all standing there in shock, because these are our casualties on that bird. They were already wounded, and these guys were just blowing the crap out of that 46 from the sides. We sent an emergency platoon over there to secure the thing and to get the casualties out of there and whatever, and they finally succeeded in stopping the machine gun fire. The guys that were on that chopper, my corpsman included, said that all they were doing was laying flat on the floor, trying to escape the rounds that were coming through the fuselage. A fuselage of a helicopter is very thin metal. It doesn't stop anything. It doesn't even stop shrapnel. It's just very, very thin for weight purposes and whatever. So anyway, and it's a vulnerable aircraft to fly it. We managed to salvage the casualties, got them out of there, called another medevac in, and got them out of there. And I don't think any more of them suffered any more than they had originally from their original wounds. And that's because the Marines went over there very quickly and secured the place.
Did they take more casualties trying to rescue them?
No, because I think it was just 1 or 2 guys that were left out there. They were just madder than jeepers because we were there messing up their party, whatever. So we got those guys out of there. We called in another bird that came in and got them medevac, and then we had to call in A4s, the Navy A4s, to destroy the helicopter, and they bombed it. Just blew the living jeepers out of it, because you don't want to leave anything. You couldn't fly it. There's no way they were going to get it out of there, so they just destroyed it in place so that the bad guys couldn't get any of the stuff out of it. So that day was a long, arduous day. We stayed in that position. We set up, the CP set up a group right in those rocks. I often found the biggest thing I could possibly find to hide behind when it came time for night to set in, and it was always on the bad guys were on the outboard side of that, because if they were going to shoot it, I wanted to be behind the biggest obstacle I could find. So we did. We camped right in the middle of those rocks. We took some incoming that night, and it came from behind. We were moving in one direction, of course. Direction of march is where the battle was, in front of us. that night they hit us with some mortars and RPGs that came from behind us, so they had circled around, and we're lobbing a few rounds in there, and they didn't cause much damage because, well, I know at least one of those RPGs hit the rock that I was hiding behind, and I'm, you know, it was big enough that we didn't do a lot.
Now, when you come under fire like that, those weapons can't be fired from all that far away.
No, no, and they weren't. They were close by.
But would your guys go out and look for them, try to chase them off, or
Well,
just hunker down?
typically what they do is you set up a perimeter. Every time you sit in for the night, you set a perimeter, and so you have people out on the outposts around or surrounding the company. And sometimes you put out little we call them killer teams, 3-man KTs they call them, killer teams, would go out just out about 100, 200 yards from the lines and sit there in ambush and just sit and listen. Their job was to pick up anybody that might be trying to attack you from outside, and that's all they were to do. They weren't to engage or anything. They were just there with a radio, and they could tell you if there were people trying to sneak up on your lines. Apparently that didn't happen. I don't know if they'd set those KTs out that night or not, because like I said, we took a lot of casualties, and they were just trying to regroup. But that was a very typical thing. And at night they would lob a few rounds, a few mortars, a rocket or something like that, and then they would just disappear. And that's what happened that night. The battle that had raged the day before was reported back to us from a forward observer in an aircraft that was flying around one of these little tiny helicopters we call sperm, because they resembled a sperm. They were nothing but a little bulbous thing with a single tail rudder and then a thing in the back. So they were very small. They were observation helicopters, and he was flying around during the battle right after that, and he told us, called back to the skipper, he said, you know, there are bodies all over the place out there. They're just lying scores, is the way he said it. Bodies all over the place. Their side, not ours, the other side. So next dawn breaks the next day, and we decided, well, we're just going to keep on going, and if there's more of them out there, we're going to catch the rest of them out there too. Well, we went over the first range of hills and then over the second range of hills, and not a single body was to be found. We did find blood trails, it was very typical, but and we discovered, well, we didn't really know until about 3 or 4 hours into the march when we came to an area where you could start to smell decaying bodies. And so we continued, and the further we went, the stronger the smell became. And if you can imagine, in the tropics, the heat is somewhere in the 90s, the humidity is almost 90, and the sun is just unbearably hot. So it's just a terrible place for that sort of thing to have. The environment just makes it accelerated process, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And then we actually got to the site. There was a mass grave, a very hastily constructed mass grave. And we discovered that these were uniformed NVA. They were not the usual ragtag guys, like I said before. They knew what they were doing, and they were organized and had better weapons, and there were a lot of bodies in that grave. I don't know how many. I have no idea.
Now, during that fight, had you had artillery or air support, or were these casualties?
We always had air support everywhere we went. In fact, that was one of the benefits that we had. Our technology was much better than theirs was. We always had air support. In fact, on that operation, we had called in a couple of airstrikes. And there was on that particular firefight with the rocks, one of my corpsmen was closely involved in that little situation. And that's an amazing story, too. Mike Smith is one of my other corpsmen. But anyway, we found all these bodies, and then we just left them there because we knew we were chasing somebody. There was more of them. We had to keep on going. The mission was to keep moving, and so it went through most of the day. Again, a lot of these situations happen toward the end of the day. I think you march so far. I think the people that you're chasing go so far, and then they just decide they're just going to stop, or they find a place to dig in and set up a defensive perimeter, and then you have another brouhaha. It just goes. Well, as it happened, we were getting towards the latter part of the day, and probably in our terms maybe 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and it was still quite late. For some reason, and this did not happen very often, the company got strung out on a line. And I think it has to do with the fact that we were coming on another one of these hills. This is a bigger hill than we'd seen at the rock pile. And it was it was on our right flank. As I remember, I'm walking through like a little valley, almost like a valley or like a dry riverbed. That's what it looked like to me. I don't know. But for some reason, like I said, we were strung out on a line, which never happened. Marines just don't maneuver that way. But maybe it was because of the terrain. I don't know. But I found myself at the rear, toward the rear of the column, tail end Charlie, bringing up the rear. And the forward elements started a firefight, and all of a sudden, same old crack, 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 all the stuff going on. Well, so here we are, and those are the forward elements. Now, we're strung out on a line. We're back where I was. There wasn't anything going on. There was probably a platoon farther up ahead, and they had rounded this hill, and were looking up to their right flank, and they had come under fire from the top of this hill. I brought up the rear, and it was happening. The first thing you hear is corpsman up. Corpsman up, corpsman up. Of course, that's what happens when people get hurt. That's what they want, their corpsman. So, and typically, again, looking around, where's the skipper? Well, the Marine is sitting there taking a break. He just sat down with all his gear and everything on. He says, he's up there. I said, of course he is. I don't know why I even asked. So, maybe I told the story already. Threw my pack at the guy and proceeded to get my way up through the ranks and get everybody up to the top of the hill. I've told the story about the skipper getting dinged. Yeah. So I'll pick it up from there. It was now getting dark. We had been in 2 major firefights in 2 days and had not been resupplied, which meant that we were getting low, especially in ammunition. And Marines they just simply didn't conserve their ammo. Everybody was on full auto with their M16s, and their adrenaline was going, and they would go through a magazine in one trigger pull, 30 rounds, another magazine. Well, anyway, we were running all out of ammo. The skipper was down, the XO was down. We had several other casualties, and I don't remember how many. I would always guess at probably 10 or 15. That was a typical number.
And about how many men did you actually have in the company going in that situation?
Well, you start out with about 200 on an operation.
And you've lost some already before you get here.
We've lost several. Yeah, we've lost almost 20, maybe more when you put them all together. A lot of medevacs were from other reasons too, not just casualties. But anyway. Dark is coming. We're in desperate situation, and we are in contact with NVA regular troops. And dark again, when it got night, that's when all the bad stuff usually tended to happen. So we were in dire straits. We managed to get all of our casualties medevac, and didn't have any. They had quiet LZs too. They weren't getting shot at when the medevacs came in, which is not always the case. We got all the guys loaded, all them out of there, and then we had the new command having to take over. One of the platoon commanders was promoted to company commander because that's what he had to do. And fortunately, he'd been around for a little while, so he had a rough idea what was going on. But we found ourselves in dire straits. I mean, literally. We discovered that we were probably surrounded by heavily armed NVA troops and had little chance of defending ourselves because nobody had any ammo. I typically carried 2 bandoliers of M16 ammo myself, and never fired a round out of that rifle, but I carried it anyway, and so I wound up giving my ammo to the Marines, who were sitting in their holes around the perimeter. And then we put the little command group together, and we're trying to figure out what in the heck we're going to do, because we really, really are in a bad situation here. What happened was the new CO communicated that back to battalion, there was no way they could resupply us. It was dark. Choppers would not fly into there, you know, and there was no way they could resupply us. So everybody had to count his rounds and set up in the perimeter and just get ready, because we thought, and we very likely could have been overrun, which is not a very comfortable feeling, believe me, not in the dark. They came up with a plan. Battalion told us that they had been in contact with the Air Force, who flew these C-130 gunships, and they happened to be some in that vicinity. I don't know where they flew out of, but there were someone close by. So, and the thing was, they went around to all of the holes in the perimeter and said, if you have a flashlight or a Kyloom or anything that can produce light, they can hold those lights straight up in the air, and get down, hunker down in your holes, because things are going to happen. So we all did that. Now, I didn't have anything. I was right in the middle of the compound anyway, and we were roughly in a big circle. You know, that's how. And then the CP was right in the middle. I had tried to dig a hole on the top of this hill, and it was like concrete. It was rocky, and it was clay, and my little shovel just wouldn't make it. I think I got a slight indentation in the top of that thing, and it wasn't even enough to cover my butt, you know. But that's all I had. So, and it's pitch black now, totally black. And all of a sudden, I'm laying there in the middle. I'm looking straight up. I'm laying on my back in this quasi hole I had. And all of a sudden, from out of the sky comes this bright red and blue and green circle of fire. It started just out of nowhere. You could hear the plane coming. You could hear the plane coming, and it came in and it droned in from one side, and then all of a sudden, in a circle all the way around that perimeter was this circle of fire that was coming out of the sky. Now imagine laying flat on your back and watching this incredible thing. Is just amazing what happened. They were firing Vulcan miniguns, and they were, in a Vulcan fires, I don't know, 1,000 rounds a minute or something like that. I have no idea. It's close. Mm-hmm. The result is that when those guns fire, it's a solid stream of fire, because every fifth or sixth round is a tracer, and then everything in between is not, of course. So if you multiply what you see by 3 or 4, there's that many more rounds coming out of that gun than what you actually see. And in the middle of the night, it's like watching fireworks, and it just simply was amazing. They circled our entire perimeter all night long. And when one C-130 ran out of ammo, another one came on station. They just kept it going all night long. Mm-hmm. Now the amazing thing about that is how accurate these guys were. They're flying probably 300-400 feet. I don't know what elevation they fly at, but they're quite a ways up there. And they kept that fire going in a circle all the way around our perimeter all night long. So there were millions of rounds fired from those planes that night. And if they hadn't been there, I don't think I'd be here today. I'm sure of it. Because what happened was, the next day, when dawn broke, the planes went off station. We got resupplied, and then we started looking around. The area around our perimeter was totally just blasted to smithereens. The feeling was that one of those guns could put a round in every square inch of a football field in like a minute and a half or something like that. So all of the foliage, everything, looked like a huge cloud of locusts. They just come and just leveled everything, and the dirt was all chewed up. It looked like somebody going with a big earth move and just, you know. Interestingly enough, we only found one body. And that body was about 5 feet from one of our holes, and the guys didn't even know he was there till the light came up, and he had been nearly cut in half by these. Now consider that these rounds had landed within 5 or 6 feet of one of our fighting holes, and not a single round, that entire barrage all night long, ever came inside of our lines, which was an amazing. Absolutely amazing bit of flying and gunnery that was them, and they saved our lives. And believe me, that's an experience that not very many people have had. Anyway, so we found a lot of blood trails, only one body. And this body had to, by the way, had his arm nearly severed and put it back together again. He had somehow wired his arm back together again. We thought that they were probably on drugs. They were high on something. That's one of our guesses, because we found some stuff, some pills and stuff in his pockets, and that kind of thing. And I think it was narcotics of some kind. Anyway, that saved our bacon that night, and we got to the point where we were pretty much exhausted, both in personnel and resources, and so they decided to pull us back for a while, which was really unusual for Marine Corps doctrine in that part of the country. So they pulled us back. We sat up on a big hill and got to get some of our back mail and care packages from home, and actually got to take a little bit of a bath out of a stream, and started to feel human again. And they brought in some good chow. They gave us some, other than sea rats, which is we ate sea rations all the time in the bush. We got MREs. We got they're called MREs now. Back then we called them LRPs, LRRP, long range patrol rations, and that was designed for people who were snooping and pooping behind the lines, and there were packages of freeze dried food that were meant to feed 3 Marines or 3 Army guys or whatever it happened to be. So it was a big package of freeze dried stuff like beef stroganoff and all the different meals. But anyway, from sea rats to one of those LRPs, which was, pour hot water in there, and all of a sudden you got a big bowl of beef stroganoff. Oh my God, it was like going to heaven, culinary heaven. It was like, whew. And I would scarf one of those down in a heartbeat. Designed to feed 3 guys, no problem. I put it away. But, and so there we were on this rocky hillside for, I don't know, 3 or 4 days, and we finally got resupplied and got remanned and all set up, and the operation continued.
Okay. How long had you been on the operation by then, do you think?
By then we were into it about, well, the whole thing lasted 52 days, so we were into it about 3 weeks at the time.
So it's already kind of a long time, at
yeah.
least, to be stomping around in those conditions and being under fire and taking casualties as it is.
Yeah.
How does the morale of the unit hold up during all of that? Did they give you the break in time to kind of restore things a little bit, or were you still kind of worn down relative to where you were to start with?
I think in their infinite wisdom, the battalion finally realized that we had been out there for over 3 weeks in heavy firefights, many casualties. Even the hard-hearted commander will realize that you got to give these guys a break. And like I said before, the only break we ever got was to go sit somewhere else in the ground. We never went back and got cold beer and ice cream or anything like that. So I think they finally realized that. And one of the incredible things about that whole operation was that this hill that we were now sitting on is where the battalion CP was. And they were watching the whole thing in the valley below. This is where we were all operating out in that valley, and that especially that firefight at the rock pile. They had watched the whole thing from their elevation. They could see it physically. I mean, literally see what was going on. So they knew what was going on. They knew that we were in the middle of some really heavy business. So we had to have a break. We just had to have a break. Now, having said that, we had the day before we got to this little respite was when we had this all-night thing with the guns going on. And there was some trauma involved in that. There was a lot of fear. There was a lot of anxiety. But the guys, I don't recall ever a single incident where morale became an issue. And it had a lot to do with, initially it had a lot to do with the skipper, who was that kind of a charismatic leader. He simply wouldn't allow them to get that way. And he was always right in their face. He was always involved in what was going on. But of course now he was gone, and so was the XO, so we had a whole new CP group. But yeah, a couple of days in R&R, sitting on the hillside, getting cleaned up, getting some key dunks, having some good time, and then relaxing a little bit, writing letters, getting caught up on that. And then, thing came to mount up, and off we go again. So we marched, we marched down the hill, get all our gear, and we were going along, and then it was getting again towards dusk. We found a place where the new CO decided he wanted to camp, so we camped. Nothing. It was uneventful up to that point. Again, this was one of these little areas where there was a very low-lying hill, and someone had dug a trench through the middle of this hill, and it probably was, I don't know, because we had units going all over that part of the country all the time, and they would probably dig some of these defensive holes and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, it was just a little place I can recall, and the company set up the usual perimeter. It was getting towards dusk again, and typically, again, there was this big rock that I found to hooch my. And by the way, after the gunny and fogey, I never hooched with anybody after that. I just simply didn't want to get that close to anybody again. I guess I don't know. I mean, I didn't do it intentionally. It's just the way I preferred it that way, to be a lone wolf after that. Anyway, I found this great big rock. I pitched my hooch, one-man hooch this time. The tarp was stretched over top in a flat way, and then underneath it I put my rubber lady and my camouflage blanket thing, those poncho liners that were interesting pieces of gear, really amazing stuff. Anyway, the night goes on. We try to sleep. When you sleep in when I slept in Vietnam, I can't speak for everybody, but when I slept in Vietnam, it was something that I would best describe as half sleep at best. And it's sort of like taking a 15-minute cat nap, where you're not really sleeping, but you're resting and you're closing your eyes and all that kind of stuff. Because of the hazardous environment, I don't think I ever completely relaxed it, especially at night. But I would rest. I would lay down on my rubber lady, and I would just close my eyes, and I would do the best I could to make it through the night after a few well-intentioned prayers, always at night. Anyway, this particular night, I'm doing my usual routine of half sleep, and interestingly enough, everybody in the CP, we were in a little circle, maybe 20 yards across. This little circle, and everybody was at a different place on the clock. The CO was at 12 o'clock. The gunny was at 9 o'clock, and I was at 3 o'clock. The XO and everybody else were somewhere in between. So we're all spread out like that. Middle of the night. It must have been 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning. Who knows? I didn't look at my watch. In my half sleep, I hear this thunk, thunk, thunk. Those are mortar rounds being launched, and they had to be close enough so that I could hear them. And the fact is that I was in my half sleep. I did hear them, realized what it was, and those rounds started to land within the CP group. Now everybody was asleep, which I find kind of interesting. Now I don't know where the radio man was. The radio man, of course, had to be on the net all the time. I don't know where he was. I don't remember him being there at that time. But anyway, the XO, the CO, the gunny, everybody was sleeping, and the rounds, these little 60 mic rounds, started landing very close inside our little CP group.
Right.
They started landing on it. And so the first round goes off, I roll. Yeah, I'm behind this big rock, so I was thinking, oh, but the damn things were coming in the middle. I was like, ah! I roll off of my mattress, and there's about 15 feet away is a hole, is a fighting hole. So the first thing I do is I run and get in this hole, because I need cover from around me, not just from outboard, but I'm in this hole. And these rounds they start coming in. Not a lot, 3, 4, maybe 6 over a period of time, and I stick my head up. There's no firing going on. I mean, the Marines aren't doing anything. I think they caught us completely back. Well, the guys were out there. But don't get me wrong, the perimeter was out there. but they were throwing these mortars over their heads coming in. And I stick my head up out of this hole, and everybody's still sleeping. And I'm looking at me. Well, how can you still be sleeping? These rounds, at least 3 of them going off right here. How can you be sleeping? So I said, geez, I got to go wake up the skipper and everybody else. So I jump out of that hole. Go to the first man in line. It was the XO. And I started shaking. Skipper, wait, incoming, wait. And he wakes up like this and then another round lands. I go, holy, he goes, man, oh man. And by the way, one of those crazy circumstances happened. That hole I was in took a round after I left it. So I went from the XO to the CO to the gunny, who was all around the clock, waking these guys up. And we wound up diving into this trench that had been dug in that and just flat out laying right down on the ground in this trench. And I got down on the ground level, and then 3 or 4 guys jumped on top of me, which I thought was just fine. Just fine.
Right.
Because if they're going to take shrapnel, they're going to get... Yeah, that's kind of a goofy way of thinking. But I remember feeling that way, thinking that if it's going to get them, it's going to get them first, not me. We stayed in the trench for the rest of the night and had no further engagement. There was just these few rounds that they typically would do that. When dawn broke, we got up out of our trench and walked around to the CP, and the hoots that I had built, the tarp over the top was shredded, and the rubber lady that I was lying on was flat. The shrapnel had gone through that thing. The gunny had been lying on a little berm, and his arm was flapped out to his side, and he had powder burns on his arm. That's how close those little rounds came, and I just don't know how it was that nobody got hit with those rounds when they came in.
Was that something that he slept through?
He slept through it until I woke him up.
Yeah.
And that's just incredible to see how exhausted. I mean, that's maybe a reflection on how exhausted we were.
All right. Well, this tape is now just about out, so stop here. Mortar bombardment. You come out of your trench and so forth, and you've kind of taken stock of things. What happens next? Well,
we got out and evaluated in the morning. We evaluated what had gone around. Everybody was a bit shocked by what had happened, especially the fact that no one had been injured. I think we sort of stayed in that area for a day or two because we started taking snipers. This is the first time and only time when I was in the country when we actually had sniper fire, and we lost a couple of Marines to sniper fire, and it was a really that is a very devastating event when it happens. People are just in their holes, in their fighting holes, and they suddenly take a round in the middle of the forehead with no warning, and that's it's shock producing. It's awe and shock, what they say about shock, that little process. But anyway, it's a very debilitating event when it happens to troops. And by this time, we were now on this operation almost within the 50th day or so, and it was getting to be really tedious to get anybody to even want to do anything. The weather was wearing us out. We were exhausted from tramping around for that long, and we had been through many firefights, lost a lot of casualties, and I know that morale by this time was really beginning to suffer. And I think it was only about 2 weeks after we left that hillside where they finally realized these guys got to get out of here for a while. So they took us offline, and we marched to Chulai, which was a base that was nearby because we were operating in that area. So they took us offline. We went there and actually had steak dinners, ice cream, all this pop, and beer. Beer. Oh, we hadn't had a beer in 2 months. That really tastes good especially when it's cold. So we stood down and we sat in Chulai for a while. And then we all trundled aboard 6x trucks, and they took us to Hill 55, which was a point on Highway 1 halfway between Da Nang and Chulai, which is a very large army base. There's an artillery battery there, 2 or 3 of them. It is a big base. We stood down for a while, and then we wound up going back onto another operation. The final operation was Oklahoma Hills was the title of that one, and so aptly named because we were actually going into the mountains this time. And so, part and parcel, the battalion loads aboard 46s, and we head west from the coast. Really, we flew for, I'm guessing, about an hour to 2 hours. So basically, what I'm saying is we were no longer in Vietnam. Okay, we were in Laos. Of that, I'm absolutely certain, but there's no way to prove it, and it probably will never be admitted by anybody. But we were. We couldn't possibly have flown that long and still be in the country of Vietnam. So, and this was like total environmental shock, because we were going from the lowlands and the rice paddies and the flat ground to the very high mountains and triple canopy in the jungle, and it was an entirely different world to operate in. Well, I had never been in that kind of situation before, but then it was all new. The whole thing was a whole new experience anyway. So, and in that part of wherever we were, there are little isolated patches of ground that have been turned into LZs or fire bases or whatever, and they're just right out in the middle of nowhere. I mean, Monkey Town. It's just, there's nobody there, but if we had been there at some time, they'd put a fire base up, or they'd put an LZ or whatever. So there were these little patches of ground, usually on top of a mountain. And that's where we flew into. We flew into one of these LZs that had been created from some group in the past. And as we settled in, the mountains to our west just rose much higher than where we were. We were on the top of a hill, and it still was going way up. And the interesting thing was, once we got all offloaded, there was, again, it was a quiet LZ. There was no fire at all when we landed. We proceeded to go downhill from the LZ, which I thought was kind of interesting. Because I thought the reason we were going into the mountains was to go up the mountains. Instead, we went downhill right from the LZ, and I mean, down we went, and then we got into some flatter ground, but it was elephant grass. It was taller than our head. You couldn't even see through it, let alone walk through it. And so we have, in my case, a company of Marines thrashing our way through this elephant grass. It was just terribly thick, very tiring, because people were trying to fight through with all their gear on. We wound up with machetes trying to hack this grass so we could walk through it, and it was just impossible. You could literally stand up and then fall straight forward, and it would hold you up like that. And for some reason, I'm thinking, why are we doing this? I mean, it seems like a goofy way to start an operation. We're sort of flailing away at this jungle grass and stuff. And after a while, we were exhausted from whacking at this grass with machetes. The whole company would take shifts and get up there and line up and start whacking. That lasted for a couple of hours, and finally the CO says, "Enough of this already. We're gonna go around this stuff." So we wound up going around it, and we started going again downhill and into some very thick underbrush, heavy stuff, but it was nothing like the triple canopy. It was just very thick, jungle-ish kind of stuff, low echelon jungle, I guess you'd call it. And we fooled around in all there for a couple of days. Now, keep this in mind. My thought was always that, like we had been doing down in Dodge City, we were out there showing a presence, a deterrent, if you will, like you said. And I'm thinking that what we did by going downhill from that LZ was a diversion. I think the more I think about it, the more I think they did that on purpose. Because again, you get 200 guys splashing around in the jungle, you make so much noise, everybody knows where you are. There's just no way. And sure enough, about three or 4 days into this little foray down in the lower part of the jungle, Back come the 46s, we get back on board and we go back up the mountain. Offload us, and this time we're going uphill. And there is a rudimentary trail of some sort that wound up through these mountains, but we wound up not necessarily going down the trail itself, but spread out in the jungle. And it was so steep that I vividly remember pulling myself up with trees, grabbing a tree branch and pulling myself up. It was, 45-degree slant, easily, just unbelievably hard. When you got 60 pounds of gear on your rifle and a helmet and a flak and all that. We finally took the helmets off and left. They took the helmets and put them back down on the LZ and gave us all jungle hats because it was just too hot, too wet, whatever. So we managed to climb up this mountain, and we go all day, up through the trails and whatever. We get about halfway up. We'd been marching at least half a day, and for some reason somebody called in an artillery strike. I don't know why at that particular point, because we were not engaged with anybody. Somewhere ahead of us, they probably anticipated where we were going, and they would try to soften up the place or whatever. But we were not engaged at the time. And I can remember standing on the trail, and now we're in triple canopy. The triple canopy is so named because there's just layer after layer after layer of foliage above you, and it's called a rainforest at the same time. And the reason for that is because there's so much humidity that accumulates in the canopy that it drips all day long, every day, and it's raining, literally raining every day, no matter if the sun's shining or not. And it's dark. It's like twilight in the middle of the day in the triple canopy. It's weird. It's a very eerie environment to be in, and then you put all the noises of the jungle in there too, the monkeys and the birds and the parrots and all these squeaks and squawks and rustlings in the underbrush, and you get it. It's just a very surreal kind of a place to be. It's just scary. It was really scary. Anyway, we're sitting there, and this artillery strike is called. So all of a sudden, wham, 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 several large rounds land. Guess where? In our own lines. So now I have several casualties, 6 dead, about 15 other casualties of various stripe, wounds of all kinds, and we're in the middle of nowhere up the side of a mountain. This is a situation that is untenable, and I, by virtue of who I was and what I was, flipped. I flipped. I'm screaming. I'm yelling, at the gunny who's standing right next to me, and what I'm aiming my epithet at is the CO who had called in this mission, or if he had, or I don't know, but I was literally flipping my wig. And it had been an accumulation of all the stress and anxiety over the months preceding that, and now here I am with 8 dead Marines and 12 other guys that were wounded in various ways, and I'm losing it. Well, anyway, I managed to get myself under control. The gunny told me if I didn't, he was going to slap me silly, so I settled down. But now we had a big problem, because we had this mission to accomplish, and I think they were probably, I would not be surprised that we were on part of the Ho Chi Minh Trail by this time, and I'm almost sure we were in Laos. Anyway, there was a big mission to be accomplished here, and they had some big plans for this operation, but here we are stuck in the middle of nowhere, halfway up the mountain, and which way do we go? The only option was, there were only 2 options. One was to go back down the trail and get all those casualties out of there. The other was to continue, believe it or not, with the mission and bring all these casualties with us, because there was no place to get them out. We had no LZ there. The LZ was 5 miles down the trail, and we had to take them all back. They decided not to do that. We would get to the top of this particular hill where we were and set up a camp and try to figure out how to get those casualties out of there. So in fact we did that. We got to the top of this particular mountain, and then we set up a camp, rudimentary as it was, in the middle of all the jungle and the canopy and all that junk. But we still had this problem, and there was no LZ. There was no way to get these guys out of there, and they were, you know, in extremis, some of them, and some of them were not having any problems at all because they were gone. But I still had 8 or 10 casualties that I had to take care of. And what happened? What we wound up doing was going around to every guy in the company and getting their poncho. And because it was raining in there, and it's cold too on top of that mountain. It's maybe 60 degrees, but it's cold compared to 90 degrees in the lowland. And you want to keep you casualty. You have to take care of your casualty. You have to keep them warm. You have to keep them dry. I mean, they're wounded people. They're bleeding and all this stuff. So we had a large number of casualties, and I don't know what to do. We went around and got ponchos from all the Marines and made a little tent city, flat top tents, strung them all together, all these ponchos together, and put them out over a large area in the jungle. And we put our casualties under the little ponchos so that they at least could keep dry. And then we went around and grabbed everybody's poncho liners, those little thin blankets that are amazingly warm. And when you get wrapped up in them, it's very thin, but it's got some kind of kapok filling in it. So even when it's wet, it keeps you warm. At least keeps some of your body. So we wrapped all these guys up, and then we had IVs going out there. So we had basically what we had was a little field hospital set up there on the top of that mountain, completely rudimentary, nothing fancy, but it was the best that we could do. And it was now it's dark, totally dark. There's nothing you could do until the next day anyway, and God knows what we were going to do the next day, because there we were. So all the company corpsmen and myself maintained nightly vigil on these casualties underneath their little tents. Kept their IVs going. We had flashlights with red lenses on them so that they wouldn't be seen at any distance, but at least they could see what we were doing. And we just maintained this all-night vigil on these guys, and it was, you know, it's all we could do. It was just an incredible situation against something we had never experienced before. So then dawn comes the next day, and they're trying to find some place where they could get an LZ or find an LZ. There was nothing anywhere in that vicinity. So by this time, the battalion CP had gotten the idea, and for some reason they showed up. The colonel and his whole retinue and all that all showed up at our pause.
How did they get them there?
Well, they flew into that same LZ where and they marched themselves up the hill, just like we did, only they didn't have the encumbrance of all the gear and all that kind of stuff. They just marched right on up there, and they were there by the next day. And so what happened next was a classic jungle penetrator evacuation thing that, again, we had not ever done this before. We were sort of blazing a new trail every time we did something like this stuff. Now, we had read about it. You know, I had known about it. I had read about vertical extraction, but I'd never done it. I mean, you don't practice that kind of stuff. But with real casualties, and we just didn't have any other choice. We had to get them out of there. So what happened was we took all of those guys out from under the little tent city and strung them all out down the trail with the guys in the body bags at the end of the tail and the most urgent casualties up front and so forth. It was a triage. So you get the guys out the first that you can save, and then worry about the people who were in dire straits or not with us anymore. There's no rush for those guys. So we had the casualties all strung out down the trail. We had a full evolution of all the Marines in the company, and all the corpsmen were all standing by one of those guys, rather. And CH-46s came in and hovered above the triple canopy, and I would have to say that's about 200 to 300 feet in the air. You know, you could barely see the helicopters because of all the foliage. Of course, their prop wash sort of blew thing everywhere around. It looked like it was like being in the middle of a hurricane. especially with all the water dripping, you know, one of those things. So they send a cable down through the canopy, and attached to the cable, depending on what casualty that we had, there was a different kind of a device. You had baskets, you had some had those folding seats that the guys could hang on to and whatever. So, you know, and then we just proceeded one by one to send these guys up through the canopy on whatever appliance they had sent down. And then one of the funniest things, what they was, well, it's not funny, but they would start to swing as they were going up. The pendulum would start to go like this, and then pretty soon they're on a big arc like this, and they're swinging off into the trees and everything else. So I got a couple of big, strong Marines, and we attached ropes to their devices so that when they went up, they didn't swing. The Marines were sitting there swinging, hanging, you know, trying to hang on and keep these guys. But there was no lack of motivation for them to do that. Believe me, the situation was that significant, and they were everybody got involved in that. And eventually, we got all of those guys out of there. Now, it must have taken, you know, time is a funny thing when you try to account for how much time did this take, how long was it? Because, you know, time shrinks and sometimes it expands, and it's like crazy. It must have, well, I had about 12 casualties, so it must have taken at least an hour, maybe probably more than that, to get those guys all out of there. And for that entire time, those choppers hovered there and drew these guys up one at a time, you know, and everybody was involved, the crews of the chopper and the people on the ground and everybody else, and even the battalion CP, the colonel was standing, 50 yards away watching this whole thing. And it went off absolutely like clockwork. And the amazing thing about that is, again, we had never done it before. So we only had a rough idea how to do this. Now, other people had done it before, of course, otherwise they wouldn't have had this practice in their armamentarium. So, well, they knew what they were doing. The guys in the birds probably did. The guys on the ground had no idea. But the amazing thing is that it came off absolutely perfectly, and we got everybody out of there. Then, of course, the mission had to go on, and so they were aware, or probably aware, of the fact that there was something further up the trail headed west that they wanted to investigate. Well, we still had the same problem not having an LZ. And if you have anything happen in the jungle like that, you can't get anybody in, you can't get supplies, you can't get anything. So the guys started whacking at trees, huge trees in some cases, with axes and machetes and all that. We hadn't brought in we had, you know, the engineers, every unit has combat engineers with them, and we did have some det cord, explosive cord that you wrap around a tree or wrap around anything and just touch it off and it blows the tree down. So we had some of that. And they started clearing off an LZ on top of this mountain here, but several days into it, it was clear it just wasn't going to work very well. So they brought in some heavy, big chainsaws and everything. They absolutely wound up clearing an LZ on the top of this mountain. But one of the problems with it was that they left big stumps sticking up in the ground. I don't know why they didn't put C4 under the things and blow them out of there, but the stumps would be 3 or 4 feet off the ground, so the helicopter still couldn't land in there. Well, they got a rudimentary field set there, and then they decided they were going to move on. Well, by the time I had finished screaming at the CO, the gunny had put me into a sort of a quarantine. He says, well, Doc, you're going out on R&R. He said, you've had enough. We've got people here that can fill in for you. Mike Crocciolo became my next senior corpsman. And he says, it's time for you to go out. And he was right, because I was burned out. Mm-hmm. So I'm thinking, okay, well, that's good, because, you know, I'm working on going to Hawaii to meet my wife. And I'm sitting up on the mountain now, and I'm sort of like I am now. I'm retired, you know, I didn't have anything to do. So I remember the company was they were marching out. And with the battalion CP, when they came up, one of our doctors came along too. One of the battalion 8 doctors they'd never go in the bush, ever. Dr. Anderson was the unfortunate soul. I remember going down to the LZ because they had, in order to go, when they marched out, they had to go down this trail and went past the new LZ that wasn't quite finished yet. So I remember sitting on one of the stumps. I think I had some hot chocolate, and the company is going on down the trail. And the last guy in the line was this Dr. Anderson, who was one of our docs. And I sort of waved. I said, "Good luck. Keep your head down. Don't do anything stupid." And he was looking at me like, "Oh, I don't want to be here. This is awful." Sort of sheepish, pale. And he was like, I mean, come on. You know, his uniform wasn't even dirty. It was one of those things. So with mixed emotion, I watched my company march off into the jungle, further out into the jungle. And the only thing I had to do was sit there and wait for a helicopter to come in so I could get the heck out of there. And so I did. I sat on a stump and I smoked cigarettes and drank hot chocolate. And then one day, a bird comes in, probably a day or two later, and the guy says, "That's your bird, get out of here." So I jump up on there, threw my gear into the back of that chopper, and off we went. And so that ended my my tenure in the bush. I did hear later on, we went back, our headquarters was in at Hill 55 back on Highway 1, so we went back through the battalion aid station there. We had arranged R&R, and my wife was going to meet me in Hawaii, and so I sat there for a while, got cleaned up, had a shower, that was good. 50-some, a long time without a shower, anyway. Got a haircut, shaved, you know, got really squared away. I even had clean uniform and everything. Just I'm starting to like this now. This is like going from boot camp to corps school. You know, that bridge of a million mile, and that was cool. But I heard that the company, after I left, they got into some really heavy crap up there. They found a major enemy hospital underground, with operating rooms, the whole 9 yards, and there was a big firefight. They took a bunch more casualties too, and you know, I wasn't there for that. So it's like I said, when I left, it was mixed emotions, because you as much as you don't want to, you do get attached to these people. You know, you may not even know their names, but they're your guys. They're the people that you fought with and sweat with, and some of them died in your arms, and the whole 9 yards. But there was a great deal of relief too, and I was glad to get out of there. It wasn't sure whether after R&R I was going to go back in the bush or not, because we didn't know, from month to month we didn't know what the plans were. You know, there were rough ideas, but nobody really knew everything there was to know. But I got cleaned up and spiffed up. I got a new, actually I put in some new uniform on, and went down to Da Nang, hopped on a plane, and off to Hawaii. And it's like I've said, it's like going from hell to paradise and then back. You know, so I met my wife, who had just recently delivered our first child. Amy was about 3 months old, I think, when she met me in Hawaii. And we spent a week there. And you know, the people were traveling all over the world on R&R. They went to Bangkok or Taiwan, wherever. They just flying all over the place. I happened to want to go to Hawaii and meet my wife. That week was like a bacchanal. It was absolutely amazing, because all you think about when you're in that situation back in the boonies is that all you can think about is your wife, of course, and your life and all that kind of stuff. And we'd only been married about a year or two at that time. But anyway, we just had a wonderful, wonderful time in paradise with the luau's and the roast pig and all that stuff. We found a shopping center, went and bought some bread and wine, and then I rented a Mustang, and we drove around to the island, found this secluded little cove somewhere out in, who knows, on the coast, beautiful rocky coastline, and we had a big picnic out there. It was just stuff right out of romance novels, and it was just so wonderful. And it was short-lived, of course, and that one of the hardest things I've ever done, even leaving the first time from Grand Rapids, was leaving her. I watched her flight go out back home, and I had to get on mine and go back to the war. And I remember sitting in the airport and getting drunk on scotch because I didn't want to deal with that possibility of going back and doing that stuff. So, and like I said, I didn't know if I was going to go back in the bush or not at that time. When I went through BAS on the way out, the chief said, "Well, I don't know, Jim. I don't know if you're going to or not. We'll see what happens." So anyway, I get back and I land and I hopped a ride on somebody going to Hill 55 and got out there and walked back into Battalion 8 station. The chief met me at the door and he says, "Well, guess what? You're not going back in the bush. Mike Crotchell is taking over your company, and you can hang around here and take care of us for a while." Oh, whatever. So that was a big relief because honestly, by that time I'd been in the bush about 7 months, 8 months maybe, and I didn't want to go back out there. I was frazzled anyway. I didn't want to do any more of that stuff. So we managed to set up a different lifestyle in the rear. The whole rest of the tour was after probably about a month they pulled Lima out of the bush altogether. In fact, I think the whole 26th Marine Regiment wound up going offline for that kind of operations. We went for a while. We went back on board ship, and we were cruising around trying to figure out what they were going to do with us. There was some talk about sending us all to Okinawa for refitting and retraining and remanning and all that kind of stuff, and then going off on some other kind of a big operation somewhere. Well, we floated around for about a month, and it's one thing to be on. I've been at ships before. I mean, I sailed a couple of crossings and all that kind of stuff, but it gets to be really boring. You can only play so much bingo. You know what I mean? And we played bingo every night. By the way, I never won anything. I don't know why. I never could win at bingo. I mean, every night and never anything. The payoff was a few bucks. Anyway, floated around for a month. Finally decided they're going to send us to shore. And we did wind up taking everything we had and going back in. We went to Da Nang this time and set up a garrison there. And the platoons were sent out in various parts around Da Nang to set up road security. The headquarters of Battalion 8 Station all stayed in one area just out of the city of Da Nang. And so we wound up actually finishing my tour there. And that was like a different world because we were no longer getting shot on a daily basis. We were not parading around in the jungle with 60 or 100 pounds of gear. We weren't involved or engaged in any way other than just some minor little forays out into the civilian world to do med caps and that kind of stuff. We didn't get involved in any more combat in my tenure there. We did have some fun experiences back then because GIs, when left to their own devices, will come up with some really crazy things to do, all promoted, of course, by prodigious amounts of beer. We had an enlisted men's club about 100 yards from our hooch. We had set up a permanent hooch with a whole nice bar in it and everything. But anyway, about 100 yards away was the E Club, enlisted men's club. And one of my corpsmen, Mike Smith, was one of the guys I was with in the field, became the manager of that club. So, he just went into town almost every day with a 6x and loaded that thing up with beer, cases and cases and pallets of beer, not just the cases. And because it was so convenient and so close, and we had all been through so much, bad stuff, we spent every night at the club. And we would buy cases of beer at a time and just go sit outside. It was too hot inside. It had a jukebox in there, but it was hotter than jeebers. It wasn't air conditioned, so we'd go sit outside on the dirt, on the ground, and just proceed to drink ourselves silly every night. Was a way to let off a lot of steam, But then things start to happen where people are starting to peel off. They're all getting ordered. Their short timers calendars are up and they're done, and they start to leave. And one by one, the people that you've been with for a long time all of a sudden start going, and then pretty soon your own time comes up, and then you just get back on the airplane and then you fly back to the world. I just have to say that whole experience from day 1 till day 365 on my short timers calendar was something that's almost it was difficult to comprehend. I'd have to say it's like surreal. The whole experience. Vietnam was a a real mess as far as messing with people's heads. You know, a lot of the stuff that's come out of that, you know, the serious stuff like PTSD and suicides and all that sort of thing. There's reasons for that, and I don't know that anybody at the time realized it, or if they did, unfortunately, didn't seem inclined to do anything about it. And so I know from speaking to new vets, the guys that have been in Iraq and Afghanistan, that the military has changed its tactics a great deal, and there is a lot more time being spent on dealing with those issues because they're very, very serious. The statistics that come out of the Vietnam War are just almost overwhelming when you consider the fact that there are 58,000 names on the Vietnam Wall. By the way, I've been there 9 times. Not for any particular design, it just happened that way. I was still on active duty. I went to a couple of seminars in D.C., and of course I always had to go to the wall. So all told, and I've been there with reunions with some guys, and I've been there 9 times. The fact that there are 58,000 names enshrined on that black granite wall is an amazing thing. But what's even more amazing to me, and that's not the right word, that there are more men from the Vietnam era who have committed suicide than there are names on that wall. And so if you think that's not a serious problem, ladies and gentlemen, you are mistaken. And I have begun to get involved in that a little bit in my own small way with veterans that I deal with on a daily basis almost. But lots of counseling, lots of chatting, lots of talking, and these things start to come out of the woodwork. And it's important for our young veterans to get involved as soon as possible with them, within 3 or 4 months of the actual event, because it takes about that much time for them to start to acclimate back into the real world after what they've been through. And that's when these issues start to present themselves. So it's a little bit off track, I suppose.
Yeah, but just in that, Van, you talked some about the kind of the replacement system, and Vietnam was distinctive in a way in that, except at the very beginning, most of the men went through on those individual terms. You go in individually, you come out individually, and the expectation was that way you'd have veteran or experienced units, or the new guys could be trained by the ones with experience, so you wouldn't have issues with completely new green units coming in and getting wiped out right away. And they sort of learned that in degrees out of World War II and Korea. But then they run into the whole problem of isolation, which seems to be even worse when you do it that way. So yeah, you didn't go in with a group of friends, and you make a couple, and on some level emotionally get burned by it, or you realize you can't afford to do that.
That's right.
And survive.
Which only compounds the problem, when you think about it. Because the last thing you want to happen in combat is to become disenfranchised with the people that you're supposed to be taking care of. And believe me, I struggled with that. But the reality was that if I hadn't have done that, I don't believe I would have lasted as long as I did. And you know, the stories are just rampant about guys who are coming back, and women too, but mostly guys that I can recall telling me stories about it and being spit on in airports in a uniform. This sort of a hate relationship that the American public associated with people who were in Vietnam, because we, by definition, were bad guys then if we were doing what our government was telling us to do, and that was the association they made, so that we were bad guys. We were as bad as the enemy, who, in some cases, they thought were the good guys. Well, you take the average GI who is a high school graduate, okay? It hadn't been to college yet, isn't old enough. It was right out of boot camp or basic training, whatever it might be, whatever service he's in. And you take that individual and you throw him into that situation where he literally doesn't know, first of all, he's not old enough to even know what's going on yet, probably not well enough versed to know what the reality is. There's always just a lot of emotion involved in that, especially with young guys. You know, and then that event itself, the trauma of being in the combat wars and losing good friends, and some of them did have close buddies that they lost. I mean, there's just the stories of rampant, they're all over the place. You take that one event, that year out of their lives, they're freshly out of high school. By the time they leave Vietnam, they're like they've been through war and combat. In that short year, in some cases, it was only 1 year. Sometimes it was 2 or 3 because the Marines went back from multiple tours. It changed their lives forever. It's changed my life forever. I know that, and I wasn't a youngster. I was, by all means, an old guy at 24 in that situation. So. I make the analogy of a train. It's a train ride, and it only goes in one direction. You know, you start at birth, and it ends at death. And along the way, you make various stops along every place on the railroad, and each time you do, you have to deal with a certain amount of luggage, if you will, suitcases. You're lugging with you from place to place, and you keep on going. In this case, you don't realize that there's a proper place for the luggage to be, so you carry it on and off with you every time you get off. You get off after the war, you got a great big sea bag full of junk, and you don't know that there is a place to put that. And somebody's sitting next to you and says, "Hey Joe, what are you carrying around this stupid sea bag for? Don't you know there's a baggage car in the back?" So you take and you put it where it's safe, and it's not going anywhere, but you don't have to lug it around anymore. That's the story that I talk to veterans about, how to get beyond over that thing. So, and it seems to work for some cases, in some cases, yeah.
Okay. I want to go back to a couple of different dimensions of your story. There are things that are in the memoir that I'd like you to fill out a little bit more. One of them sort of just has to do with collectively, what kind of impression did you have of the Vietnamese themselves? Either the ones out in the villages and the rice paddies, or anybody you saw in the Da Nang area, or people who worked on the bases? What sort of images or impressions do you carry around with you?
While we're in the bush, there was a singular impression that they might all be VC. And I know that's not accurate, but it is to the degree that enough of it was there to warrant that kind of paranoia. And I remember thinking that distinctly whenever we passed through a village. And by the way, there were only 2 or 3 instances where we went through a village where there weren't any people in it at all. There were always the ubiquitous chickens and dogs and things, pigs running around everywhere, roosters crowing all the time, and that environment was. But then, see, there were other times too, where we would be on a foot patrol, just like outside of Hill 55. We got invited into a village one time by the village headman, the chief of the place. And this is one of those times where there were actually people in the village, and we were on a patrol, foot patrol. I don't think we had a full company. I think we were out for like a platoon or something. And I just happened to be along because I wanted to get out in the world a little bit. Below Hill 55, well, that is a controlled area. Hill 55 was an immense military complex. So the area surrounding there is pretty well under control. Right. There's not a lot of VC running around, although they did lob a few rockets and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, at this particular day, we were walking, and this guy invited us in to have lunch, which was a great honor. And everybody, even as paranoid as we were, realized that this was a great honor to have one, because they didn't have any food. I mean, there are peasants out there scrabbling on the ground. They got their pigs and their chickens and all that kind of stuff, but they didn't have anything they could give to anybody else. Well, they made a point of it, inviting us in there. So the CO and myself and the gunny, and I think probably the radioman, got invited into this hut, and this guy proceeded to feed us. I don't even know what we were eating. It was some kind of fish, and there was some kind of meat, and I don't know what it was. I asked people if their water buffalo ever died, did they eat those? Water buffalo was a main function for their farms and such. They had these huge water buffalo that would till the ground and all that kind of stuff. I don't know, but he never gave an answer to that. But I, to this day, I don't know what I was eating. And the other thing is that it was one of these very cordial meetings where nobody really understood each other. I mean, we didn't speak much Vietnamese, only very, very few words. and the guys in the village didn't speak any English, so it was one of these sort of like Indian meets the cavalry thing, you know, you sort of sign language and all that kind of stuff. But it was a very cordial and peaceful and nice experience for a change. So then if you go into the cities, now I never got into Saigon. Saigon was just a very, very large city, very cosmopolitan, very civilized, if you will, compared to what's going on the outside and the outskirts around it. But I did get into Da Nang. Da Nang was Saigon on a much smaller scale. There was a lot of, let me say, very primitive huts that these people lived in. They literally built them out of detritus from the war. It was pieces of corrugated steel made a roof, cardboard walls, whatever. And in those huts were an entire family of Vietnamese with kids and grandpas and grandmas and great-grandmas and all that, because they seemed to live a long, long time. Even under all the squalid circumstances, they seemed to survive for some reason. Very, very strong physically, and they must have been emotionally too, because they had been through so much war in that country well before we got there, and it was just another chapter in their history book of war from one generation to the other. For they were strong-willed, very the people that you got to know, if you ever had the luxury of getting to know Vietnamese, they were very loyal people and sincere. They were very helpful, very structured. We had a few that worked in our compound. So one of the problems with that is that anytime military went anywhere, they always wound up somehow collaborating with a certain element of the local population. And in our case, I'm sure that some of those were bad guys. I mean, you literally didn't know if you went to get a haircut if they were going to cut your throat or shave you. You know, it was one of those things. I mean, that's how you felt. You had to have that mindset in order to survive. And it became actual survival tendency is, I don't trust anybody. And if you don't trust anybody, that little kid's not going to walk up and hand you a hand grenade, which happened in the villages sometimes. You go out to do a med cap and the little kid will walk out with a hand grenade, hand it to you. Boom. So, you know, and there were stories about atrocities. You talk about impressions of the Vietnamese people. There were some stories of atrocities on both sides, by the way. Some of the things that we heard about, and of course, every time a story's told, it's embellished a little bit to some degree, but depending on who's telling it and how far removed from the event it is. But when we were in the bush, we were told about Marines being ambushed and then having their genitals cut off and stuck in their mouth, and then a little sign, you know, something to the effect, well, you better not bother coming around here, or something. It was meant to be a deterrent. Well, then our side started doing something like that, only not the physical defacement of a body, but leaving little cards, calling cards. Ace of Spades was the thing you'd leave on a body, and that was a sign. That was like, you know, this is what's going to happen to you if you just keep doing this, da-da-da-da-da. And then there's just other stories that you hear, the My Lai incident, for example, and so forth and so on. I had the most time I actually spent with the people, Vietnamese people, was when I was on that first assignment in the Villes doing that cap thing, wandering around, and I got to know a couple of people fairly well. And then somehow you have to develop trust. In order for that thing to work, you have to trust each other. And one of the difficult things for us, that is Western kind of people, is to let your hair hang down and trust that, allow that to happen, because you really don't know in that environment who's your friend, who's your foe. And so what happens is, by default, you fall into this paranoia, and you just don't let them get anywhere near you.
A different group of people. Toward the end of your stay there, you're in Battalion A Station. Now you're working with some of the doctors. How are doctors, the naval doctors, how are they different from most of the rest of the personnel?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think the answer should be fairly obvious that physicians, especially young physicians, are rebels of the first order. They, unfortunately, some of them unfortunately for them, the Navy has put them through medical school, so they owe a certain amount of time back to the Navy, and it's about 6 years or something like that. But the guys that I knew, the lower level docs, the field type docs, the people that were in the field medical hospital, or field medical hospital, as opposed to the established naval hospitals, that's a different world. But in the field, those guys, and in training too, and the ones that were attached to the Marine Corps, the Battalion 8 Station, were rebels of the first order, every single one of them. I don't think they even wore their hat. Marines call them covers. You have to have if you go outside, you have to have a cover. And these guys, they purposely would not wear them. In fact, one of the guys, I remember his name right offhand. Anyway, he was the ringleader of the rebellious set of we had 3 docs that were in our Battalion 8 Station at Camp Lejeune, and he wouldn't even iron his uniforms. He would come in completely disheveled, unshaven, wrinkly old uniform, and he didn't give a rip about anybody. He didn't care if they wanted to kick him. He said, "Kick me out, I don't care. Throw me out, I don't care." So Blackburn, Dr. Blackburn at Blackburn, and he, of course, he was a physician, so he was an officer. He was a lieutenant, Navy lieutenant. Lived in officers' country on the base, on the Marine Corps base. Officers' country is like a different world. It's like kingdom, a different kingdom from the rest of the base. You know, I'm trying to think of a word, I can't think of it. But anyway, he lived there, and he would just throw parties at his house, and he'd invite all of us enlisted people over there. And of course, that was absolute no-no, especially in the view of the Marine Corps, because fraternization is a sin, a deadly sin. You don't do that. Blackburn decided, heck with that, he didn't care about any of that stuff. He had a major living next to him, and we'd have parties and get just ripped. All the enlisted guys, and we're out on the lawn, rolling around, and just carrying on. And they called the MPs, everything. It was just, but he didn't care. They were very young. The thing that I remember most about the physicians in the field in the Battalion 8 Station at Da Nang and Hill 55, they were very young. They couldn't have been out of medical school more than a year or two. And I swear, I think I was about as old as some of them were.
Yeah, well, they'd be about 25, probably.
Yeah, I was almost as old as they were. So, and you know that, you just sense that. And I never asked them, but very professional as far as it went. But they didn't have all that much experience. And these were not the guys that I was with who were working in the MASH type hospitals. These were the guys that were just in local little Battalion 8 stations. They weren't the ones doing the crash surgery on the hospital ships or anything else.
Right.
And they hadn't moved to that point yet. They hadn't even begun. They were doing like an internship is what they were doing. Nice guys. We had a lot of fun. Had a lot of parties.
In Vietnam, didn't they kind of promote you for a night?
That story. Well, this is one of those events that I talked about earlier about where we had some fun. Actually, we let down our hair and got goofy once in a while. This was a case where we're talking about a couple of these young doctors who wanted to go to town. And there was a place called the Pink Elephant. It was an officers' club that was right down on the river. It was right down in the middle of Da Nang. And these guys, the 2 doctors said they want to go to town and get drunk. Well, they hadn't. None of them had been anywhere, and they had no experience in the bush, so they wouldn't go without a couple of Cuss corpsmen went along with them, to ride shotgun, because they were like total naive babes in the woods, literally speaking, out there, and they didn't want to be out there by themselves. So they took a couple of us combat vets with them. We all piled into a Jeep one evening and set off for town. Well, it happened that in proximity to their officers' club was a NATO enlisted men's club. So we had, us corpsmen, had a place to go and have a few drinks. So we got in, we parked the Jeep on the street, the docs went into the old club, and we went into the NATO club, and we proceeded to spend the evening there for a few hours. But the difference, again, there was this stratified layer between officers and enlisted, that their requirements were somewhat less stringent than ours. Mm-hmm. So by the time the NATO club was shutting down about 10 o'clock, and that we had to get out of there. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but when we got back out to the Jeep, the MPs told us that we need to get out of town altogether because there was a curfew. Mm-hmm. Well, we're sitting there now. We've had 4 or 5 beers. We're a little fueled, you know, except for the fact that by that time we'd been in the rear drinking so much beer that it didn't affect us nearly as much as it would have a month or so ago. But anyway, we're sitting out there in the Jeep and we're twiddling our thumbs and thinking, well, you know, we got to get out of here. The MPs are going to throw us, or they're going to arrest us, one or the other. Well, the docs didn't show. Finally, I said, well, it's getting to be late. We have to get out of here. So I went into the club. And, of course, enlisted men are not allowed in there. But I said that I went to the guy who was at the front desk, and I said, you know, Doctor, this and that, Doctor, that, and I have to get in touch with him, or at least give him a message. Mm-hmm. So one of them came out, and I said, you know, Doc, they're throwing us out of here. The MPs are going to lock us up, or there's a curfew. We got to shut down and get the heck out of here. Well, he went back and got his compatriot. They both came outside. And we went out, sat around talking at the Jeep for a while. They were really pretty well lit by that time. They had been drinking scotch, whatever, drinking beer, you know, all those things. And they all decided, well, we're not ready to go. We're not going to go back yet. I said, we have to. You don't have a choice. Oh, yes, what we do, he says. One of them said. And I said, and what might that be? He says, well, we're going to take you inside with us. We're going to stay around for another 2 or 3 hours. And they had told them inside that for the officers there was a special truck that came by at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning and took them back where all of us enlisted pukes had to be off the road. You know, the curfew was such that that's the way it was. But they still didn't want to be there by themselves, these 2 young doctors, and they were pretty drunk. So I said, well, what do you suggest? I can't go in your club. I mean, it's against the law, and we're in a combat zone. I mean, well, we have an idea. They said they each took their devices off their caps, which were officers' lieutenant bars, and here hand them to me and put this. I said, no way. There's no way I'm going to do that. I could be shot, literally, probably. I don't know. But anyway. They convinced me that I was going to be promoted to a lieutenant for the day, well, just for the next 3 hours anyway. And so somehow, honest to God, I don't know why I did this, I acquiesced and said, okay, fine. I took off my collar devices, which were sergeant devices with a caduceus on one, mm-hmm. put on railroad tracks, one on each, and now I was officially a captain in the Navy, lieutenant in the Navy, captain in the Marine Corps. Mm-hmm. And then into the Pink Elephant we waltzed. The 3 of us sat there for the next 3 hours.
Did the other guy take the Jeep back?
Yeah, the other guy took the Jeep. He had to get it off the street. So I sat there, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, this is totally against everything that it's actually illegal, mm-hmm. and downright dangerous. You shouldn't be doing that, especially impersonating an officer is major. That's court-martial offense. But under the circumstances, we were all pretty well, and I was just in trepidation that somebody in that club would recognize me, mm-hmm. because there were officers from all over in all the different units that were there hanging out. It was a big place, and typically well appointed, and the officers club tend to be that way anyway. Leather chairs, nice little cocktail tables, and a big old bar along the wall. But it was the waitresses in skimpy mm-hmm. outfits. Well, this thing I died and gone to heaven here, because mm-hmm. this was really, and besides the fact I started drinking scotch too. Mm-hmm. And I admittedly got rather stoned. But after the first couple, after that, all the fear just went away. As I just started, mm-hmm. acted like I belonged. And actually, I looked almost old enough to be one of those guys. Right. So the fact is that there was nobody there who knew me, and we got it through, and I didn't get shot or anything. But there's a funny ending to that story too, because After they threw everybody out, they pulled a 6-by up on the street out in front of the club, and everybody had to get out of there. And they had, I think they had an MP escort or something, because they were all in different places around town. They just drop them off. It's like a bus. So all of these, by now pretty well drunken officers, including myself, fake officer, climb in the back of the 6-by, and we all sit, facing inboard. There's people on one side and people on the other. Sitting across from me are the two docs, and I'm sitting here, and there's a Marine Corps lieutenant and a couple of other, I don't know who all's in there, but we trundle off into the truck, and we're heading back towards our area. And the young lieutenant, a Marine Corps lieutenant, was sitting next to me, and he started chatting with Chatty Cathy, the fact that he'd been lit up so well, he was even more salubrious than he might have been. So he was just going on and on and on and asking me all kinds of questions. And of course, I outranked him according to what my collar devices said. So he keeps saying, Captain, where have you been? What have you been doing? And these guys, the doctors are sitting across from me, and they're just laughing. They're almost laughing. They're smirking, and they're doing this kind of thing. They know the charade that's going on here, and they think it's just the funniest thing since anything. And this guy is annoying. He's really annoying, and he's just asking me questions. Captain, where have you been? What have you been? Finally, I turned to him and said, listen, I appreciate the fact that you want to maintain conversation, but where I've been is classified, and I really can't tell you that. In fact, it was. And that ended the conversation, and by the time I got off that truck, I was just, I was shaking in my boots because I was sure somebody was going to discover that, and that's just a totally horrible thing to do in the military, but it was fun. And it's a funny story, too.
Right. Now, once you do then finish the tour in Vietnam, it's actually now your day comes and you get to go. How does that come about, or how do you get back home?
Well, the weird thing is that actually I was offered a second R&R just before I left. And I think I had arrangements to go to Hong Kong, if I can recall. But then my orders came to D-Rus to get out of there, and I said, screw Hong Kong. I don't care about that. I'm getting out of here. And it's just one day. You get the papers. The orders come down, and then you just go down to the airport. You turn all your gear in. They won't allow you to take anything that was in the soil of Vietnam out of the country for contamination reasons and all that kind of stuff. Some guys managed to sneak a few items. I brought some boots. That's the only thing I had that I brought. But the weird thing is that you're still in a combat zone, and you leave your weapons and everything. You just turn them all in. And all your gear and all your web gear and your packing. So you just turn it in. Flak jacket, helmet, whole 9 yards. And you just get on a little truck, and it takes you down to the airport. It's like going to Gerald R. Ford International. But then you feel so vulnerable because your flight doesn't leave until the next day. You still are in a combat zone, by the way. And every once in a while, the bad guys like to throw a few of these rockets your way. And you feel very vulnerable. I don't even have a bat that I could, protect myself with. But that's another part of this. What a crazy world the whole Vietnam experience was. It would just go from, in one case at the beginning, you go from a normal world into a combat zone, and then at the end you go the opposite. But that transition is not something that just happens automatically. It takes time. And one of the reasons why so many people, as they first came in the country, were lost is because they hadn't acclimated yet. They hadn't gotten used to the environment. They had no idea what to do or how to do it or anything else when the bullets start flying. Well, see, just the opposite happens when you leave that environment. Now you're transitioning back into a normal world. By the way, I've been hyper for the last 8 months. Everything is on edge. I don't even today, as I'm sitting here, when I walk in the woods, I always watch where I put my feet on the ground. And I know there's no booby traps out there, but it's like ingrained. It's one of those things.
All right. Well, that's tape number 2. I want to kind of pick up a little bit on your sort of the rest of your story. What happens to you once they actually get you on that plane and they send you back to the States? What happens at that point? Do you get discharged quickly? Do you have other duty to do first? Or
They had a special arrangement during Vietnam that if you had less than 6 months on your hitch, that you could get out early. And so I took advantage of that. They flew us directly from there to Long Beach, California, and we started to get, muster out of the Navy at that point. I had to stick around for about a week or so while I did all the out processing, all the paperwork and all that stuff. So they put me in with the MPs, and I went and patrolled the streets and the bars. Another form of warfare. But that was pretty uneventful. It was just a matter of driving around in a Jeep with an MP and, going to a few bars and bringing guys out, taking care of them, patching them up, whatever. But that time, that went very quickly, and I found myself at LAX, and the first time and only time I ever flew standby on an airplane. I was in uniform, of course, and didn't have any problem. And flew home. Straight home to Grand Rapids. My wife and my dad and mom and everybody had this nice welcome home at the airport, which was unlike a lot of my peers. Unfortunately, the people returning home were often not treated very kindly at all by the local populace, depending on where you were. Usually at a major airport somewhere. That was not my experience. And then I was technically off active duty, but still in the active reserves, and naval reserves. So I still had another 2-year commitment on that end of things. So that was always something that was in my immediate future anyway. So I still was going to be in contact with the Navy, only in a slightly different role, entirely different role, of course. But homecoming was, in my case, was a positive one. I did not have any of that bad news stuff or bad signs or demonstrations or any of that kind of stuff. As a matter of fact, we lived in Rockford at the time, and Rockford United Methodist Church was my home church and my wife's home church. So they put together a welcome home party, which was, I used to sing in the choir in that church for years and years and years, and my dad actually was a choir director for a while. But anyway, the point of it is it was a home church, and it was a welcoming home specifically for me, and the choir sang songs, and we had an informal, it wasn't in the church, it was in the utility building. We had a volleyball and stuff in there. So it was a very positive and warm welcome, and I think probably one of the reasons why I adapted quicker than a lot of my peers was that precisely for that reason. That was another one of those goofy things about Vietnam. And we have not made that mistake again either, as far as the welcome home stuff goes. But anyway, quickly adapted, and except for the fact I had a new daughter that I had not seen. And she was 3 or 4 months old, I think, when we got home. Her name is Amy. And we knew some friends in town because we lived in Rockford all the time. Wound up renting a house there for a while I searched for a job. I think in retrospect, although all things outwardly seemed normal, that I felt like I was acclimating back into the real world and starting to relax a little bit and not be horribly concerned about what had happened in the war. There still was something probably not completely right there, but I only can say that in retrospect because at the time I didn't think there was any of those issues. But I became quite moody. My wife will tell you this: moody and kind of explosive temper and short-tempered and mildly anxious about a lot of things. But at the time, totally unaware of it. I just thought it was part of my nature. And of course, I'd been through a war, so I felt a little different, and certainly was different. And I know now, after 40 years, that I'm totally changed by that 1 year in my life. But that's part and parcel of what goes on in those situations. Anyway, adapted fairly readily to the world around me and in the civilian world again. I wound up getting a job with my dad. My dad at the time was a skilled woodworker, so he worked in a clock factory in Zealand, and so he got me a job working with him, and I became a belt sander in the wonderful world of clock making. And that went on for a year or two. All the same time, I was drilling down at the drill center, at Naval Reserve Center here in Grand Rapids, every Monday night, because I was active reserve. We had people that were coming in to the reserves for physicals. We had doctors, we had a little battalion aid station set up there amongst the Marines and the Navy. So we were doing physicals every Monday night. The doctors were there. We would help out with the physicals and then sign all the paperwork and all that kind of stuff. And that went on for about 2 years. In the process, there was an individual who was also a former, well, active Reserve Navy hospital corpsman, first class, by the name of John Audshorn, who was a friend of mine. We became friends. And he suggested that I get involved in this nursing program at Butterworth Hospital. Now, the first time that he mentioned that to me, I sort of, well, yeah, right, I'm going to be a nurse? No, that's not my kettle of fish. I don't care to get involved in something like that. Because back then, this is 40 some odd years ago now, there was a certain amount of stigma attached to men in the nursing profession. And of course, I was a macho Marine corpsman who was probably at that point the height of testosterone, and that simply didn't fit into my plans for life anyway. But the ironic thing about that is that most of my life was never planned out anyway. My wife will tell you how I keep putting things off, procrastination to the nth degree. But you know what? I found over my 65 years of life that hasn't hurt me all that much. As a matter of fact, I never make snap judgments on anything until I've had a chance to analyze and think them over before I take any action at all, and that's worked pretty well for me. So anyway, this whole idea of becoming a nurse was unsettling at first, but then I got to thinking about it. I said, well, you know what, I've already done most of that stuff. I've been trained to do all that stuff, and John kept working on me all the time. So you need to do this. I mean, they're actually recruiting men in this nursing program now, because that was the time when they were starting to expand their roles, and the whole idea of becoming a nurse didn't have to be so generic. You didn't always have to be a woman to be an RN. So, and they were actually recruiting. And I said, well, you know, this was like in midsummer. I said, school starts in August. It's too late. He says, no, it's not. Just drag your butt down there. Tell them who you are. Tell them I sent you. That's right, John sent me. And I'll guarantee, he says, you'll get in. And so I did. I went down there and just walked in one day and said, hey, I'm Jim VandenBosch. Wonder if you have any openings in your nursing class coming. He said, absolutely. Within a half an hour, I was matriculated, and then launched my career in nursing. Butterworth Hospital at that time had a nursing training program, which was a 3-year diploma program, is what they called it, which was affiliated with Grand Rapids Junior College. So a lot of the standard academic studies were done at JC, and then all the clinical stuff was done at the hospital, and in True Butterworth Hospital, and the auspices of those two things combined came up with this degree, this 3-year diploma thing. Back in that time, there were a lot more 3-year training programs for nurses than there are today, because most of those programs have faded away. The world of professional nursing is now pretty much evolved into a 4-year degree program, although there still are some 2-year programs around. JC has one, right. CC has one. Yeah. And my son was actually involved in that for a while, but it didn't work out for him. But anyway, make a long story short, we spent 3 years both at JC and at Butterworth. Those 3-year programs, by the way, and I can say this from the benefit of being on both sides of the fence again, those 3-year programs were the best clinical training environments that there could possibly be, because they were not so concerned with achieving a certain level of academia. They were more concerned with achieving the highest possible level of patient care, and they did that in a practical way, because 3 days out of 5 were spent in the hospital taking care of patients. In baccalaureate programs, again, I can speak from experience here, there's not that much clinical on-hands practical training while they're going through their academic studies. So, and to a certain degree, I think it's a shame that those programs have faded away. because of the fact that they graduated so many more capable on-hands registered nurses than the baccalaureate programs could ever dream of. And that was, of course, that's a bias. But again, I have both sides of the story, so I can, with some degree, comment on those things.
Now, were you still working at all at this time?
I had taken advantage of the GI Bill, and I had quit working with my dad after a couple of years. That was a nowhere job, and it was, you know, dusting things and sanding things. And anyway, it fulfilled a need. We paid our bills for a couple of years, but what I wound up doing was utilizing GI Bill to pay for my nurses training, and at the same time, I hooked up with Rockford Ambulance, and I would ride ambulance at night. Through the night, so we got on the ambulance crew, and then that was a little supplemental income. You get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, somebody's crashed into a tree out on Northland Drive, and you had to go out there and pick them up and take them to the hospital, that kind of stuff. And that was just a natural extension of my training too. Right. So I fit right in there, and it was a nice thing to spend some time. It got a little bit hairy sometimes with some of the high-speed crashes we had to pick up, but that's again, I've already done all that stuff, so it didn't bother me all that much. But yeah, we went all the way through that 3 years, did the clinical things, came time for graduation, and the recruiters come around. The Navy, Air Force, and Army actually came into the school. They were allowed to do that. It was a private school. It wasn't affiliated with a university or anything. So they came around and they started telling their stories, and I was a bit intrigued by the fact that nurses, when they were graduating and going into civilian nursing at that time, were making about half of what they were paying in the military nurse corps. So to me, with the prior experience, and by the way, since I had kept my active reserve time going, I had a straight line of service already. So I had 6 years of accumulated service by the time these recruiters came around and recruited me into the nurse corps. So then it went from that point on. I didn't have any broken service, which made a lot of difference when you talk about pay and you know, longevity and promotion and all that kind of stuff. So again, it was one of these no-brainer things I had never planned for. It just happened that it was the best choice at the time. And of course, what that meant was I was going to go back in the Navy. We had started to establish a life in Rockford. I had actually by that time bought a house. And we were buying it under a land contract from a good friend of mine who I'd known, my dad knew for years and years and years. And we're starting to raise our little family, and we're starting to settle in, and we've got all these things, and all of a sudden we're going to, I went home one night and said, Christine, I'm going back in the Navy. And she just about fell off a chair. I said, yeah, they've made it so, such a good thing to do with all the benefits and everything. I mean, I can't not do this.
Well, nurses are officers, right?
Right. So then, and what came with that, of course, was a commissioned officer status as an ensign. So I jumped through all the hoops, signed up, said, yeah, I want to do that. They gave me credit for all my time and all that kind of stuff. So, and then I was commissioned an ensign in the United States Navy Nurse Corps with 6 years in time already, time and grade. That's a good thing. So again, off I went on a little trip to the East Coast, to Newport, Rhode Island, where they have officer candidate school. They call it Knife and Fork School. They want to train you how to become officer and gentleman, but I already been declared one by Congress. I mean, I had the paper to prove it. The Congress of the United States declares you an officer and gentleman. So there you are. I've already got the thing, but no, you have to go through this thing. Okay, so you go through the hoops. And we learned protocol. We learned what's the difference between enlisted and an officer. We learned about the responsibilities. We learned about everything, the little possible things that we're to learn about. Frankly, I forget most of it. It was sort of like being at boot camp again, only on a much lighter scale. We had inspections. They actually came around the barracks. Because most of these people, mostly women, of course, had never done anything like that before. So they're in there with their pledge and their dusters and their cleaning off the room and cleaning it. I'm thinking, no, I don't have to do that. You know how to shine? I know how to spit shine shoes. You want to? Yeah, I'll do your shoes for you. Okay. And so we had this kind of a reciprocal arrangement that, you know, I'll help you if you'll help me, and so forth. So we spent, heck, I don't even know, 8 or 9 weeks, OCS, I don't even remember how long it was. All I remember was that it was in a very picturesque setting in Newport, Rhode Island, which to this day I love dearly. And back then, you could get a pair of lobster for $8. You know, try that out.
Doesn't work in Newport now.
No. Anyway, enjoyed the area very much. Got to travel a little bit around New England. And I was by myself. Christine had stayed home with her folks. And so after that graduation, I got to put on my bars, and then off I went. First duty station out of the gate was Great Lakes. I went back to Great Lakes where this all started some, 8 or 9 years earlier. And so I was then a member of the staff of Naval Hospital Great Lakes, which at that time was a fully functional hospital. We were still in the middle of some of the end products of Vietnam, so there was still a lot of business to be had in these major hospitals all over the country. I started working on an orthopedics ward. It was a combination ortho and neuro. Interesting place. A very large hospital, 400 beds, something like that. Big, large staff. I had no problem assimilating into the officer role. As a matter of fact, I was an ensign. Figure this, most ensigns are first in the Navy, they're brand new. I was an ensign in the Navy with 3 rows of ribbons, so it was a little different than your average ensign swinging around the wars, you know. And so there was a very positive rapport, because most of my patients, of course, were enlisted, and of course the corpsmen that were working under the nurses were enlisted too. And so, having again been on both sides of the tracks, it made for a little bit better ability to control, understand, and develop and lead people who, you know, in many cases had no idea what that was like. If you're an officer, what do you do? You know, well, you lead. You know, and of course my main mentor had been in Vietnam, the skipper, who I didn't adapt all of his style. I mean, I simply didn't have that off-color vernacular that he had, and nor would I have used it in a situation anyway. But his other leadership traits are what I adapted. I always tried to lead from the front, not from the rear. In other words, if I had a hospital bed that needed to be made and nobody else around doing it, I'd make the bed myself. Where a lot of officers, nurses would say, well, H.N. Smith, do this, you know, by the way, clean up this thing over here. No, I always led from the front. If the bed needed to be done, and I was there, and there was nothing, I did it. What happens when you do that, and that's just one small example of what leadership is really accounts for, is that the people around you see that you're doing that. And there doesn't have to be any direction or anybody telling them that. Because of the fact that you are a military organization, we always have a mission to accomplish, doesn't matter where you are, whether you're in combat or whether you're not in combat, whatever it is, you still have a mission. In our case, in the major hospital, is to take care of our patients and make their environment as positive for them as you can, and safe, you know, heal their wounds and all that kind of stuff. But it takes people to do that. Now, that doesn't happen serendipitously. That's something that happens by the concerted efforts of people together. And when you take a group of people and put them together, they become a team. And the best thing an officer or any other leader in any other world can do is to establish this idea of teamwork, that we're all in this together. With a delicate line in the healthcare industry of being, we still have this officer enlisted demarcation that has to be observed. And you can do that for the most part. There are times when you can just abrogate that a little bit, and I have done that over the years too. But for the most part, they will begin to follow a leader, not someone who sits and says, do this, do that, do that. The one who does it themselves, they will follow much more readily than they would somebody just sitting around. And that's something that I had just learned, and that is, I think there are things, there are natural leaders and there are appointed leaders, and the natural leaders are the ones who really run the show, and the other ones can only be figureheads in some cases, and they don't even listen to what they're saying, but they follow the natural leader, and that's what happens in all groups I've been involved with. Not necessarily me, but there is a natural leader there. Great Lakes was a short tour. I remained there. I got promoted to Lieutenant JG within a couple of years. I think I was stationed there for like 2 years or whatever. And then they started to have reduction in force stuff going on, and this was in the 70s.
Right.
And there were a lot of people who were just getting riffed right out with 17, 18 years service and all that kind of stuff. And of course I had 6, now I had about 8 or almost going on 9 years. And I didn't want to hang it up. I was getting into this stuff. You know, I got promoted and I'm starting to like it a little bit. And then I got orders for Philadelphia. So I got transferred out of Great Lakes, went to Naval Regional Medical Center, Philadelphia, which at that time was a very large operation too. With the adjacent shipyard and whatever that goes on in Philly, that was a major evacuation point for the East Coast, along with Bethesda and a couple of Charleston and a few other ones. So then I went to work at the Naval Regional Medical Center, Philly. I became a staff member of the surgical intensive care unit there. And that, by definition, is a highly technical, position and all that kind of stuff. And we went through a couple of years. Then I became the charge nurse of that unit. I become the head nurse, the head nurse, if you will. And we went through the usual drill. We prepared for JACO inspections, Joint Commission and Hospital Court, all that kind of stuff, and all the technical junk and all that. And we had some ups and downs. We had some training problems. We had some personality problems. We had to solve those. And for some reason, again, by this time I had got promoted again. I was now a full lieutenant. So when I was made in charge of this place, I was a full lieutenant. And then we did some dialysis. We did a lot of really technical stuff, and intensive care being what it is, ventilators, all that emergency stuff, and blah blah blah. Then I got promoted again, and they sent us to Guam. They picked us right out of the East Coast, of all the possible places. The farthest it could probably go without getting back into Vietnam was all the way to Guam. And I mean, they pick up everything you own. They even take your cars, all of our furniture, all of the stuff, and even we had 2 cars. We only took 1 car. Had a van, big white Dodge van. They shipped it over there. So we go to Guam. Now look, we get a family. Now we have another daughter. Jennifer came along. And now we're all on Guam. And the kids are, now Amy's about 10, and and Jenny was 7, something like that, I don't know. Well, here we are in tropical paradise. Guam is a very small place. It's 38 miles long and about 8 miles wide. And that's it. That is your world. And from that point, it's about 3,000 miles, the nearest point of land anywhere. Not quite that far, but an exaggeration is that you're quite isolated out there in the middle of Marianas. And to some degree, we described Guam as being like Hawaii only 10 years ago. It was a bit more primitive than Hawaii. It was an American protectorate, by the way, so all the laws, they patterned themselves out of the state of California. That's what they do. Even their policemen look like chips, highway patrol guys. Honest to God, they wear the jodhpurs and the helmets and all that stuff. And their government is that there is a governor and a lieutenant and a house of the whole 9 yards. An interesting place to live, and there's a lot of history, as you would well know, about what happened in the island of Guam over the years. You learn a little bit about that by having been there, with the early Chamorro population having been decimated by the Spanish, I believe it was, in one of those wars. I don't know, but the people of Guam have been transformed into something that that was not their natural life. They're different now than they would have. Of course, now they're westernized and all that, but their original, what's the word I'm trying to say? Culture has been totally transformed. The Chamorro people they told me were well over 6 foot tall, very high, very tall people. Guamanians now are like Japanese. They're quite small in stature, and only 5'8", 5'9", occasionally one or bigger, whatever. But yeah, you in a place that small, as condensed as everyone is into that small area, you do become more a part of the environment than you do in a lot of places, certainly in big cities. What I mean by that is that we had a hospital there. The Naval Hospital was the primo health care on that island. There was a civilian hospital too, but not nearly to the standards of ours, which is by definition is going to be different anyway. Different training, different background, whatever. Anyway, when you work in that small hospital, I actually was working in a ward. By that time I was lieutenant commander. So I was now operating in just a standard ward, just everything, because that's the way those remote hospitals were put together. Everything went into one big room, surgical cases, medical cases, orthopedic cases, psychiatric, everything, all into one room. And so basically that's what I did as far as the clinical side of things go. But the real part of life in Guam is experiencing that milieu, that environment, which is so different than anything most people are accustomed to. The people themselves, for example, Guamanians. There was a certain amount of antipathy between some of the population. Why, I don't know, but they didn't like the military there for some reason. I don't know why, because it supported the whole economy, and I don't know. But there were a few rebels, and then every once in a while a Marine would get beat up at a bar or something like that, and they didn't like it. But for the most part, they're very warm, very hospitable people who can cook. Oh my goodness, some of the food that we had in Guam, and you go down to the market and they'd be all kinds of these delicacies that they made, and it's just so good. You actually strike up some acquaintances with the local folks, and they become almost part of your family to a degree, and they invite you into their homes. And then we had a guy who worked with us at the hospital. He was a janitor. Don't remember his name, doesn't matter. Every once in a while, one day he said, Jim, I want you to come up to my house. The next day off, you had to come up to my house. So he lived up in the north part of the island. We lived down in the south, and so I drove up to his place, and we found he had a nice little house, nothing extravagant by any means, because he was not a very wealthy guy. He was just an average guy, blue collar Guamanian. And he said, we're going to the beach. We're going to go fishing. I said, okay. Well, he's going to do it. He takes me down just a short way from his house down to the beach, and he brings out his nets. And these fishing nets, and they throw out into the water. I said, I don't want to do this. I mean, come on. I'm a Yankee. What do I do? Well, he proceeds to teach me how to throw the nets and fish in that primitive way, and then we spent a couple of hours doing that. You get out and you stomp around, and you go out and you stomp around and herd all the fish in towards the beach, and then you throw your net in there. Then you catch whatever you catch. Of course, what you catch are all these Polynesian wild-looking little goofy colored things that I don't know if you can eat half. I don't know. I didn't know what they were, but anyway, we proceeded to round up a little net full of fish, and then he built a fire on the beach, and then we were walking around, and he reached down, and he came out with an octopus. He's pulling about a little one, about this long. And he proceeded to kill it right there. The way they kill their octopus is they turn their head inside out, and then they bite him, and it kills him. And then we put that thing on the fire and roasted it. So we had freshly killed roast octopus and a bunch of other little colorful fish that I can't name right there on the beach. But those are the kinds of experiences that cannot be replicated. You can't read about them. You have to experience them in order to get the true value out of something like that. And it's like you make a connection with somebody on a different level, and although you're from entirely different worlds, there's still a commonality of friendship there, and it's just it's like The Odd Couple, he and I, but it was just a truly meaningful thing, and he initiated it. So later on, I was having a party for a bunch of my friends down at the naval base, and I invited him to come down and cook, because he knew how to cook all that stuff. So he comes down, he comes on the base, he's not supposed to be there, he comes on the base and he sits up at my house. We had a barbecue set outside, and he proceeded all night long to cook all this food, this wonderful Guamanian fare that was just wonderful, and everybody loved it. It was such good food. But again, it was one of those reciprocal things that you just, you know, that was a good thing and a very nice thing to do and a cool experience all told. Guam was a fascinating place in many regards, other than what we've already talked about. There's so much history involved there, of course. The battles, some of the battles in World War II were fought there. There were 2 invasion beaches there, actually, on different sides of the south and the west. Anyway, the point of all of that is when the Americans went in there to retake Guam, they assaulted on these 2 bases, these 2 beaches. And in one beach, Diriganya, there's still some relics in the water. In fact, one of the things that you do in Guam is you snorkel or you scuba. I never really had an inclination to scuba because I just didn't want to go that deep in the water with strange critters. And I mean, the sharks and stuff there. But snorkel we did a lot because you could do it over the reef and you didn't have to worry about sharks and stuff like that. So if you snorkel on these invasion beaches, you will find relics that are still left there from the invasion. And in one place there was a Japanese Zero down there. Another one I found a live 50 caliber round that had been there for, well, when was the war over, you know. And then inland, up in the highlands, up in the mountains on Guam, are some of the old war brothers. A couple old tanks up there that are just rusting off into nothing. And there actually was a guy who was living out there in the jungle for a while. He had been there since the war was over. And it was shortly before we got there in 80-something that he was found and came out. So, you know, a fascinating place. And the old runways from when they launched the bombers against Japan are there, out in the jungle. The old runways are still there. The buildings are all gone, but the concrete runways are still there. And you can walk out on there and it's just amazing. And a fun place. You know, all together, we were there 3 years, and we had a lot of fun. My kids loved it. You know, they actually all went to the schools, local schools. I didn't put them in private schools. They wanted them to experience the real geography of the world. In fact, everywhere we went, I put them into public schools because for that express reason. I don't want you to be sheltered. I don't want you to get a slanted view of life. I want you to know what it's really like. So they lived in inner city schools, worked in inner city schools in Philadelphia, Chicago, North Chicago, Guam. And later on, you know, when we left Guam, I got orders eventually to leave after 3 years. It was a good tour. Got orders to Oakland, California, Naval Regional Medical Center, Oakland, California, which was also a very large naval hospital at the time, over 600 beds, I think. We lived on the island of Alameda, which is just off the coast of, right across the estuary from Oakland, California, and out into the bay, San Francisco Bay. And Alameda is sort of a place like time forgot almost. It's at that time there was still a fairly large naval station on the island of Alameda, and the whole 9 yards. They had shipyards and the big docks and the carriers pulled in their whole nine, all that stuff. That has since faded. That's no longer an active military base, but at the time we were there, it was. Time forgot this place. It's like Arrested Development somewhere in like the 40s, and like you'd think of L.A. and Hollywood being in the 40s. All this stucco roof buildings, little low, you know, Spanish motif buildings, and the palm trees and all that kind of stuff. And you drive down the street and you swear it was 40 years ago in Hollywood. This is what you think of it when you see the place. And it hasn't changed since. The reason is because it's landlocked. They can't go anywhere. They can't build anything on there. It's just an island, and they've covered every square foot of it. Anyway, that was an interesting place to live. And of course, anywhere in the Bay Area is a fascinating area. Anyway, San Francisco is an amazing place. It's more than a place. It's a different world, San Francisco, because of one of the things, the very liberal points of view in that part of the country. Actually, the whole state of California, but San Francisco is a hotbed of all this wild and crazy stuff, going all the way back to Haight-Ashbury and all that back in the day. But still a fascinating place. California is a wonderful place to live. I would say it's a better place to visit than it is to live because it's horribly expensive. Everything is very expensive there. We had the benefit of living in Navy housing, which was completely paid for, and it was very nice housing, by the way. The house that I lived on in Alameda, in the real economy, would probably have been worth at least $1 million, and I'm not exaggerating here. A tiny little shack on Alameda was sold for $150,000, $200,000. The place I was living was a 4-bedroom ranch with a fireplace, the whole 9 yards. It would have been at least $1 million on the economy there. But anyway, so we had a pretty good time there, and the hospital was cool. I became charge nurse of an orthopedic ward there, and I was in charge as lieutenant commander, and I was in charge of this ward. Then I switched over to the staff education department, became an educator and trainer of all different kinds of people going into the hospital, orientation programs, ambulance driver programs, everything you could think of that had to do with medical stuff that they had to learn how to work there. I worked in the SIC there for a while too. The amazing thing, well, a really significant thing that happened while I was there is that I applied for and got duty under instruction, because I was still operating on my old diploma program thing and didn't have a degree or anything. So I applied for duty under instruction, and lo and behold, I got it. You know, it was one of those things where if you're a good guy, you get what you get, and if you're not, you don't. It's one of those. I was a good guy. I mean, a good fit reps and everything else. And I was lieutenant commander by this time, so it was pretty far up the ladder. So they sent me, took me off duty, and I went to school. My duty was going to school for 2 straight years. I stayed in my housing. The Navy paid all the tuition, books, everything. And the only thing I had to do was go to class every day, and sometimes not every day. Sometimes it was, in the summertime, for example, I didn't have to do anything. Well, I took some classes anyway, just because I wanted something to do. I took a karate class and a computer programming class. It's goofy things you do. But anyway, that was a public health oriented program, and basically, as opposed to a hospital based program, this was a community based program. So when we did our clinicals, we went into the public health department in Oakland, California, and believe me, that is an interesting place. Oakland is much different than San Francisco, just across the bay. Fascinating in its own right, but scary in some places. Just anyway, I actually got into doing clients in the city of Oakland, up and down the streets, up the mountains, down in the lowlands, along everywhere. Which was, in my training, was just a wonderful addition to what my background had been to that point, because I had never really done a whole lot of that kind of stuff, you know. So for 2 years, that's what I did. And I stayed in my house. We lived all over. We went all over the place, traveled up in the mountains, and went over down the coast, went down to Monterey, everywhere, up into Napa Valley. It just, you know, and it's a wonderful area. But like I said, permanently live there? No way, no way. So after I graduated, what I was slated to do, and what I had been planning all along since I had gotten commissioned, was that I wanted to go teach corpsmen. And why I wanted to teach corpsmen was because by that time, most of the veterans were not in active duty military anymore, so there weren't a lot of people around who'd had the experience that I had, especially as a corpsman. And I felt that that would be a valuable commodity for the Navy, you know, and in their logic would see the sense in that. Well, of course, it didn't happen that way. I got orders to go to 29 Palms, California, which is 400 or 500 miles south of San Francisco, out in the middle of the Mojave Desert. And there is a little tiny hospital out there. At that time, it was just a small little, almost like a dispensary. 29 Palms Marine Corps base is one of the largest bases of its kind in the world. It's a desert training facility, and it's just immense. I forget how many thousand square miles, but I mean, desert is desert, and there is nothing out there. But it gives them a lot of room to play with their guns and stuff, you know, and drop bombs and whole nine yards. So that's what they do. And everybody who's had any affiliation with Marine Corps has been to 29 pounds. Every Marine I've talked to has always been to 29 pounds. They always go there for training or whatever. Some are actually stationed there. 29 pounds is what I would describe as the armpit of the world, as far as being a habitable place. Because here we are in the high desert. Now, the entire state of California, by the way, is high desert. I don't think people know that. Even the Sequoia up north, the redwoods and all that, it's still desert. Until you get up into the mountains, the foothills of the mountains, it's all desert. So anyway, being in the middle of the real desert in the Mojave is like living on the landscape of the moon, because there is very little natural vegetation, you know, scrub little trees here, whatever, little bushes, creosote bushes that stink like creosote, tar. That's what they smell. Especially when it rains, it smells like tar. Dusty, windy, you have all these whirligigs, dust storms that fly through. If you don't have your windows closed, your house is full of dust immediately. And anyway, to me, it was not a very, I didn't enjoy my time in the desert. My kids, however, interestingly enough, did. By now we had a third who had come along, my son Nathan. He was very little. The two girls were now in their teens. In fact, one had already graduated from high school, and the other one was in her sophomore year, I guess. The distance in the desert is not measured by miles. It's measured by time. You know, how long does it take you to get to San Diego? 4 hours. It's not, you want to go to the mall? 3 hours. It's not 40 miles or 50 miles. It's 4 hours. It's all measured in increments of time, which is kind of interesting anyway, because out in the middle of nowhere, there's absolutely no idea that anything is going on, let alone time is passing, and you can measure it by the sweat of your brow if you're doing anything at all. But as much as I didn't enjoy it there, it was, again, a different experience, and we all learned from it and had some experiences there. But I was happy to retire at the end of that tour, and I guess at that time I'd had enough of it too. Although in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have. I probably should have stuck around for another 7 years, and I'd had a full retirement. And by the way, I was headed in the right direction. They were going to send me to some really cool places, but I got tired of it. And so I hung it up for good in 1989, retired, came back home, promptly went to work again for Butterworth Hospital. And this time I was involved in occupational health and employee health. So I had run a gamut from everything known to man except I never did any pediatrics, and that was okay because I didn't really feel comfortable with little people. You know, big people I can handle, little ones I wasn't too comfortable with. But anyway, so I finished out my entire career at Butterworth Hospital, where, interestingly enough, again, it had all started as an orderly back in the 60s. It finished in 89 in the very same place. So I kept coming back to my origins, I guess, one way of putting it. But that was interesting too. The problem with healthcare, though, in modern healthcare, now we're talking fast forward from when I was doing it up to the early 90s, became so burdened with outside influence in the form of the Joint Commission of Accreditation of Hospitals and OSHA and a few others, that it became difficult to practice your profession, to the point where you were challenged at every turn that, you know, everything had to be just so and thus and so. Why? Because somebody else said so. Well, I've been in this profession 40 years. I know what I'm talking about. Doesn't matter. so much pressure is turned on, as a matter of fact, that it got to be an unpleasant place for me to be anymore. And I got to be at the ripe old age of 62. I had consulted with my financial counselors and all that kind of stuff, and the guy literally he looked over our numbers, crunched the whole 9 yards, and he said, well, you know what, you ought to retire at 62. And I said, why? He says, because you may not live to 66. That's literally what he told me. He said, there's no point in the difference that you're going to make in your Social Security between this year and that year. You can make up for in taking more time, getting a little less money, but you've accumulated more money in the long run as long as you stay healthy. Like, it works for me.
Okay.
So in January, I think it was January, I'm trying to remember, I cut it and run. And now here I am, into my 4th year of retirement from the whole milieu, and I spent a lot of time still talking to veterans in my local chapter of VFW, and find that to be an extension of what my military career was. I'm actually, VFW is structured roughly according to military lines, which would seem obvious. It would seem obvious to an observer from the outside. But the reality is it's more like a paramilitary organization or a quasi-military, because the guys, for whatever reason, don't seem to want to follow the military model, because for the most part they were all civilians for the most of their lives. I happened to spend 23 years in the Navy, so my model of leadership is the military model, which you would think they would say. It's just difficult to comprehend why they don't do that. But nevertheless, a worthy organization. The numbers are dwindling as the people have passed away, especially most of the World War II vets are now gone. We still have an active group of Korean War vets down there, and the rest of us are Vietnam vets, and now we're starting an infusion of the Iraqi vets and people who are still on their ways going over to Afghanistan, probably in the next few months. So, when I first got there, we still had a few remnants of the World War II group, and then with the Korea group, and then the Vietnam group, and then the Iraq group. All 4 different decades of war in one place, or representatives of those in one place, which was one of the most phenomenal aspects of the whole thing. And as I've been talking here about the effects of combat and war and all that, and the mental side and the physical side and all that kind of stuff, I found after talking to all of these veterans from different generations and different decades that the root situation was still the same. That is, the experience is the same no matter how old you are or what war it happened in, because like I said before earlier on, but this invisible line that one crosses when one becomes a combat veteran is the same no matter where or who or how. And that is a key issue that should be dealt with by people who are going to be dealing with veterans and veterans' problems and issues. And the only reason I come to this kind of a thought pattern is because I never stopped being a healthcare provider. I am extremely interested now in the psychiatric side effects of war, and because I've had them myself. And there's nobody, in my view, that can deal with those issues better than someone who's been there and done that. Right. Unfortunately, talking about veterans groups, is that when they go to the VA, they have school-taught psychologists and shrinks and psychiatrists who have no real experience. They have lots of book learning. They're bright people, don't get me wrong. But a veteran who has issues is not going to respond to somebody who hasn't been there and done that as well as they would to somebody who has a lot of book learning. And I found that to be true just dozens of times, just in common conversations with people. They do the best they can. I mean, there's not a lot of psychiatrists that have been in war. Some of the best books that are written on the subject, Lieutenant Colonel, I'm trying to think of his name, on war and on combat. Not Grissom. What is his name? Anyway, two of the best books I have ever read on the subject of combat, and written by the same guy. He's Lieutenant Colonel Shrink in the Army Reserve now, I think. I think he's in somewhere in Texas. These two books are given to, in my experience, to the Marines who are about to deploy in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're required to read these two books before they go. And what it is the best thing I have ever read on the subject of killing, which is what those people are trained to do, and then all of the after effects and the anticipation and all that kind of stuff of what might happen as a consequence of your doing that. And then the same thing of the combat role. What is it? What's going to be expected? How are you going to? All that kind of stuff that I've been talking about here is all in there, and it's absolutely amazing stuff. I wish I could remember his last name. Now I'm drawing a blank. It's awful. It's sitting right over there at the table. So that's my life now. I just keep interested. I'm always will be interested in what our veterans are up to and what our active duty people are up to. I have this lingering absolute love affair with Marine Corps. I had the great honor and pleasure of speaking at their Marine Corps ball this past summer. I was invited as their honored speaker and all that kind of stuff, which in itself was an honor. And of course, I didn't want to do it because I don't give speeches. I'm not a big speech kind of a guy. I tell stories. So that's what I told them. I told them stories. 3 of them that are on this tapes. And just, the incredible thing about that experience is that this is a company of Marines, two-thirds of whom are combat veterans. The other third hasn't deployed yet. And when I walked out on the floor, I don't use a podium. I don't like to stand behind obstacles. I like to talk and walk. And so it's a nervous habit. It's because I don't do it a lot. I'm not a public speaker per se, but when I do, I have to walk and move. And when I walked out on that floor, here's all these 200 Marines and their wives, they're all dressed in their regalia dress, blue uniforms, and the ladies have gowns, and it was just, and they're all like 20-something. So this moment of deja vu hit. It was like, this is what it was like 20 years ago. You look exactly the same now as you did then. It was a wonderful experience, and glad I had it, and I'm glad I did it. After that, it's just been a daily time. Now I've come in contact with you, and we're doing some new things, which is kind of fun.
And if you're not careful, I can get you in quite a bit of trouble. There's still a lot of places where the things that you know and can do can help maybe a whole lot of people.
Well, I'm hoping to do that. Like I said before, I've intimated to you that the older I get, the more I feel that I have this legacy that I should be sharing. The experiences and the knowledge and all that kind of stuff doesn't make me anything special. I'm just a guy that did all this stuff, and I just happened to be in these places and did all it. That was, happenstance, pure circumstance. But what's left behind is a great deal of knowledge and experience that should be shared. Yeah, I just can't keep my mouth shut once I start talking about this stuff. So I look forward to the opportunity of doing that any chance I get, just like I do with my cronies down at the VandenBosch.
All right, and people should just stay tuned to your book, which will do our best to
we're
find
going
ways
to
to get
work.
published.
We're going to work on getting that thing out there too, because a lot of what I've said, most of what I said, is in that book, that manuscript that I call my memoirs.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking
Well,
the time.
thank you for the opportunity.